Okay, everyone, we're live. Great. Welcome again to the second day of the first interim meeting of Minerals Business and Economic Development Committee. Yesterday, we had a few issues came up, so I'm just going to remind everyone of the decorum for the meeting. Please remember to address the answers to questions and that through the chair. Please put your cell phones at least on silent. And remember that the testimony is to the committee through the chair. This is not a question and answer session between those testifying and to stay on subject. We have a lot of ground to cover today. We covered a lot yesterday, actually finished a few minutes ahead of schedule, and all of that. And I'll remind everyone here of my rule. If you're in the room, you're fair game to be called on. And that any questions from the audience? Dr. Crook, I have this habit of, I think someone could provide information. I just call on them whether they want to speak or not. So, okay, with that, let's get started. So the first thing on our agenda is oil and gas and pipeline issues. And let's see, I think we have Policy Director Luthi, Oil and Gas Conservation Commissioner Kropatch, Public Service Commission if they choose to come up, and PAW. No, we don't need a roll call. No, we have it from yesterday. No, we don't need a roll call. Oh, okay. And Representative Conrad and Senator Cooper will be joining by Zoom. They're both out of town on work issues. And with that, I think that the good co-chairman had something he wished to say this morning.
I do. Privilege the floor for a moment, please.
Please proceed.
Thank you. Committee, amongst our ranks is a recent graduate of the University of Wyoming, pure cowboy. I'm going to take time to honor Representative J.T. Larson. He just finished his business degree. He was acknowledged last night at a big dinner at the University of Wyoming. And he tells me last night, as we're coming out, that he's going to take it on to a master's from the University of Wyoming. So we congratulate J.T. Larson.
Congratulations, Representative Larson. Great. So with that, gentlemen, proceed.
Mr. Chairman,
Please.
my name is Tom Kropatch. I'm the State Oil and Gas Supervisor for the Oil and Gas Commission. I just have a few short slides. And in my packet, they start on page 17, if you have that.
Director, do we have these in our packet?
Yes, and the same one we used yesterday.
Okay.
There's slide 7, starts on
All right.
slide 17 with my pipeline discussion. And Mr. Chairman, the Oil and Gas Commission doesn't have significant rules on pipelines. What I copied there on that page and runs into the second page is the entire set of rules that we have on pipelines. And really where our authority rests on pipelines are the infield flow lines, as we call them in the rules. You might hear them as gathering lines. It's the pipelines and the flow lines that run from the well over to the production facilities, maybe from there out to a disposal or an injection well. So it's the flow lines and the gathering lines that are out in the oil field and used. You can see in there, if you read through, I'm not going to read through those rules, but what it really addresses is the abandonment of those gathering lines and flow lines at the time and an operator were to abandon those. And it talks about whether or not they need to be removed or if they could just be purged of any material that's in them with either inert gas or normally water and then capped and buried in place. And so that's what those rules really reflect. So on the next page, on page 18, again, we have authority over those infield gathering and flow lines. It includes oil, gas, water, and any other materials that are flowing through them. You know, whatever might come out of the well is what's in those lines. It could also include CO2 for purposes of today's discussion. So if they're doing an enhanced recovery project and they're injecting CO2 in the wells, those lines that are in the field from the injection headers out to the wells, we regulate. It could be H2S or helium or any other gases that are coming out of the well and to those facilities. On the next page, page 19, our authority over those lines typically ends, or at least we say they end at the sales point. So whether that might be a LACT or a gas meter or something like that, that's typically where we say they end. But we do have some authority over the gas processing facilities, or what's known as a gas plant. And so we may have some authority over pipelines that go into those facilities as well, since they're considered part of the gas production process. And then other agencies may also have some authority over pipelines, depending on where they're located. For example, if they run through an environmentally sensitive area, then PHMSA and the Public Service Commission may get involved in those as well. We do have other rules that I didn't copy in here, but you know, if there was a leak or a spill or something from one of those pipelines, and we have other rules in our environmental section of rules that would address that. So these aren't the only things we would do with a pipeline, but generally that's where our authority on pipelines is at, as we see it from the commission standpoint, Mr. Chairman.
Okay,
Take questions.
thank you. Questions? Okay, Mr. Luthi, do you want to weigh in on this one?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Randall Luthi. I'm currently the Policy Director and Chief Energy Advisor for Gunner Borden. So thank you so much for taking an interest in this. I will tell you that we did bring this attention to the committee as an idea for interim discussion. And part of that is just where are we in Wyoming? As we look forward, we believe that there's going to be more and more interest in the moving of CO2. And the most effective way to move CO2 is through pipelines. We already have one major pipeline that moves CO2 through basically the center of the state. But there's a possibility of a sequestration center a sequestration hub in northeast Wyoming, one in southeast Wyoming, and one in southwest Wyoming. All those are great possibilities. It opens up the opportunity for a whole new industry for Wyoming, a whole new branch of economic development. So what we asked the committee to do is let's talk about this. We don't have any firm direction for you. We just think it's a great opportunity to talk. You've already heard that we have several agencies that have interest and may have some authority over pipelines. If they're interstate pipelines, certainly PHMSA and FERC are going to be the agencies that are going to be the general regulators. If we have pipelines intrastate within the border, we have some options. The counties currently have their own sets of regulations. That can be fine. That can also be, end up with numerous different regulations as you go across county lines. We also have the Public Service Commission that may have the authority to do it right now. So what we're looking is really for the committee to get down, ask questions, find out what's going to really work for industry. We also want the possibility that we have consistent regulations. I think there's nothing more difficult for an industry to deal with when you actually are dealing with, one agency may tell you one way to do it, the feds may tell you another way. And particularly within the state of Wyoming, as we attempt to go through our regulatory reform, we want fewer regulations. It's not that we don't want thorough protection. It's not that we don't want thorough safety. But we certainly want to make it as easy and as certainly as, I would say, confusion-free for the industry as we can. So with that, Mr. Chairman, those are brief remarks. And again, thank you for willing to dive into this subject.
Questions?
Really.
Okay. Mr. Co-Chair.
And at the governor's level, you're hearing from a lot of these companies that they're coming and asking, inquiring about Wyoming. How can we make this work better? Just maybe a couple of prime examples so the committee to understand how this is vital to moving everything forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr.
Please.
Co-Chairman. Frankly, the companies started coming when this came onto your agenda. And it was, what is the governor up to? What does he want to do? And I have to say, I've gone right back and said, we want to know what you need. If the current system works, let us know. If you think there's a better way to do it, a more efficient way, as we look forward to more pipelines throughout the state, let us know.
Other questions? Okay, Representative Lawley
Thank you,
and
Mr.
then
Chairman.
Heiner.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Mr. Luthi, thank you for being here. And again, this may be for either one of you or someone else in the room, but how can we get a complete map of particularly all the pipelines, but even identified which are intrastate versus interstate and what kind of pipeline they are? That would be very helpful in trying to parse these issues. If we could get, even if they were in two different maps, but we could have that information of what currently exists and eventually get to the type of pipeline it is. So anyone that could help me with that. So thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lawler.
Supervisor.
A good source of that information for probably much of what you're looking for, it would be coming up here in the future, Mr. Whitman, Director of URI. They, when the Pipeline Authority that had put a lot of that information together kind of merged with Energy Authority, they took over a lot of that data. And so he may be able to provide it or provide some instruction on how you can access that data.
Okay. And I'm looking at someone who might have that information who I'll call up in a minute, but before that, Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Luthi, congratulations on your additional assignments and the responsibilities, but we have had some CO2 pipelines interstate and intrastate since the mid-80s. Are you aware of any incident or accident that has transpired in those pipelines? They were built by two different companies and they've been in service for many decades now. Are you aware of any incident or problem?
Advisor?
Now, Mr. Chairman, Representative Heiner, thank you for the congratulations. I appreciate that. I do believe these bags will disappear under my eyes eventually, but we'll get that. Representative Heiner, no, I have not heard of any specific issue or accident that has occurred in those pipelines.
Okay.
Follow up.
Follow up.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as these pipelines are being built, I assume they were built to a specific code, ASME or DOT, that's consistent for their service. Is that correct?
Mr. Luthi?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Heiner, I'm going to agree with you because I don't know of anything different. I mean, usually if you have an interstate pipeline, so you know you're going to have to meet FERC requirements or PHMSA requirements, I believe all companies make sure those requirements go throughout the entire line. So there at least is consistency.
So one more.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Mr. Luthi, do you anticipate if the state put jurisdiction over some of these pipelines, they would be built or operated under different scenario or different codes or in a different manner than they are right now?
Mr. Luthi?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Heiner, I think that's exactly why we want to have the discussion with this committee.
Thank you.
All right. Other questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know in other states, there's, some resistance about CO2 pipelines, and I've seen, articles talking about just concerns over the safety. And so I guess my question is, if a person or a member of the public had questions, and we just heard it, are you aware of any accidents, leaks, ruptures, any problems? Where would they go to find that information? Do we keep track of that at a statewide level?
Mr. Chairman. Senator Ellis, I am not sure where you would go. I mean, again, if it fell under the jurisdiction of Oil and Gas Commission, they would have that. If they're interstate pipelines, you would likely get that either from FERC or PHMSA. The counties may very well have that as well. And if I may, Mr. Chairman, I really appreciate you bringing up the idea of CO2 pipelines and safety. Frankly, as far as I can tell, there is the major accident that occurred on a CO2 pipeline actually occurred because of a landslide, nothing to do with the pipeline itself. And that's been in the news for the last 6 months. It's in some publications floating around. But once again, pipelines as a rule are very, very safe. They're a good way to actually transport materials.
All right. Other questions? Okay. So one thing we're looking at with this topic is, and Mr. Luthi and Supervisor Kropatch alluded to, is there have been some questions come up on safety of pipelines, especially with CO2. And the only one I can think of CO2 line that had failed is the one that Mr. Luthi referred to. I believe that was in Mississippi or someplace down south. And that, but it's something that we've been asked to look at. And it goes along with the next topic, which is the corridor initiative. And so that's the reason for this topic, is to raise the issue. Do we need to do something or not? I'm very reluctant to start passing large legislation controlling intrastate pipelines. I don't think it would work. I don't see Director Whitman here, but I do see Mr. Jeffries. And so I will exercise my prerogative that I've already warned everyone about. So Mr. Jeffries, would you care to come to the table, please? I think you can answer some of these questions based on your previous experience and what you're doing currently for EORI, Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute. Just remember, I did warn everyone, you're in the room.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Brian Jeffries. I'm working now as a consultant for the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute. Previously in my career, I included a 12-year run as the executive director of the Wyoming Pipeline Authority. So a great deal of prior experience related to pipelines in Wyoming and pipelines in general. So I was invited to present today on the Wyoming Pipeline Corridor Initiative and to answer any other questions that the chair may wish to ask.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Jeffries, I think you've heard some of the questions, and I think you have some very detailed knowledge and history on some of that, if you would, please.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Lawley, to your question of where can you learn about where pipelines are, what kind they are, I will get with staff at the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute to show you how to access the pipeline database that they maintain, and you can sift it by type of pipeline, natural gas liquids, crude oil products, by name of owner. You can get all that information. And so you can see it instead of one gigantic spaghetti bowl, if you wish to see it by product, by owner, et cetera. That's easily done, and they'd happily walk you through it and give you the access to the interactive website that does it.
Mr. Jeffries, I'm going to interrupt you for a minute there and for the committee. When the Pipeline Authority, Infrastructure Authority were combined and the Wyoming Energy Authority was created, there was a great database of information on pipelines, massive amounts of information. They got picked up by the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute kind of by default. And if you remember, the legislature did approve putting that into the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute as one of their functions is to maintain that database. And we did do funding with it, if I remember correctly. I have a number in my head, but I'm not going to repeat it. I'm not sure it's correct. So that resides now with the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute on all that information. Am I correct, Mr. Jeffries? Okay, thank you.
You are correct.
So please proceed.
The other question, and I believe accurately answered, was that if you are looking for information on accidents, the PHMSA database has an accident list for type of pipeline, location, era, et cetera. So we could probably provide some assistance to anyone who wanted to better understand how to find things in the PHMSA database.
Okay.
All right, with Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I'll go on to the presentation.
So, Mr. Jeffries, is this the one on the corridor initiative, or is it generally on the pipelines?
This is on the corridor
Okay,
initiative.
let's hold on that one for a minute while we finish this topic. So, and you can just stay there. We'll probably have some questions. You're probably better suited to answer than your two cohorts sitting there. Maybe.
I beg your pardon, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you,
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman, depends
Luthi.
on the question.
Okay, we will give you the hard questions if that's okay. So I think for the committee, one thing we need to decide is, do we need to do more than we're doing with intrastate pipelines in Wyoming? Or currently, are we good enough? I've heard both sides. I will tell you that the American Petroleum Institute just recently, and I think that was in the last week or two, issued a standard on CO2 pipelines and issues with them. I have a copy of it, but it's considered proprietary, so I can't just give everyone here a copy. I think we can pull some information off of it at some point. So that's out there. We have FERC, we have PHMSA on pipeline safety. Is voluntarily for the pipeline companies meeting those? Do we consider that adequate? I hesitate starting to get way into that. Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think not so much on the intrastate, but the interstate. I don't follow it so closely, but at the federal level, who is appointed to the FERC commission has, shifted somewhat. There's some political things I think happening always. And so, looking at our other things that we monitor as a legislature, we're always fascinated by what the BLM's doing and other federal agencies, but I don't know that we always have the most robust discussions about FERC and some of their decisions and rules that might impact what's happening in Wyoming. So I'm wondering if our presenters or any of them have that information, or what are some things we need to be focusing on in the media? Should we be weighing in more on certain rulemakings? I am a little curious that maybe we don't always have our eye on FERC like we should and other federal regulatory agencies.
Gentlemen, any of you care to weigh in on that, on those questions?
Mr. Chairman, despite my indignation, I'm going to ask Mr. Jeffries to answer this question.
Mr. Jeffries.
Mr. Chairman, a couple things. PHMSA, Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, is currently in the process of amending their rules specifically regarding CO2 pipeline safety. They finished the prospective writing of those rules on February 2nd, when they submitted the rules to the Office of Management and Budget, who has 90 days to review them before they're disclosed to the public. So we don't, at this point, know what they say, but it was a topic pushed onto PHMSA to address, partly over the concern of an accident in Mississippi and a growing need for CO2 pipelines. So there is an active effort to modify, expand, improve, if you will, CO2 pipeline specific regulation at PHMSA, which is the overriding safety criteria for all pipelines. Other regulatory agencies such as the FERC or others regulate other aspects of pipelines, such as rates and terms of condition of service and siting. And currently there isn't a nationwide siting entity like the FERC does for natural gas pipelines. And there is no nationwide entity that sets rates and terms and service and conditions for pipelines. So there's a whole segment of regulation other than safety that is sort of unaddressed.
Okay. Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, for anyone, but perhaps Mr. Jeffries, on an intrastate pipeline, could you walk me through the process if I wanted to do an intrastate pipeline in Wyoming? Who would I go to? How would that start? Who looks at what? And how do I get that pipeline laid if I want it there?
Mr. Jeffries.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lawley, couple layered answer, and I'll try to be quick with it. As was discussed earlier, for a CO2 pipeline, there isn't a statewide jurisdiction over that. It becomes county level for federal lands, individual federal agency approvals. So it's a process of a pipeline company wanting to build something to go out and address each individual jurisdiction that they have to deal with, rather than an overriding one. A suggestion to put someone else on the spot in the future. Last night, I spent a good bit of time reading an excellent treatise on CO2 pipeline regulation nationally and within the states, written by a professor at the University of Wyoming, who I think is an expert on the subject. Tara Rigetti might be the perfect person to more authoritatively answer questions about regulation, both federal, state, and the status of trying to coordinate that regulation.
Mr. Jeffries, I've made a note. We're very familiar with Ms. Rigetti. We've had her here numerous times and we'll bring her back. If she's not already around. So, okay. Any follow-up or anything? No. Okay, so other questions? So, Mr. Jeffries, correct me if I'm wrong. We do have the CO2 pipeline corridor initiative, and we'll get to that in a minute. But it's my understanding there's also kind of I'd call it a broad corridor along Interstate 80 for a whole bunch of pipelines. Is that the case, or do they still need to go through the whole process when they put a pipeline in across Wyoming? I think there are 12 or 13 lines in that corridor right now.
Mr. Chairman, there are indeed a great many natural gas liquids, crude oil, and there may be a products pipeline in that corridor, and the number may well be a dozen. And they're all co-located in part because the topography that led to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad favors building pipelines and highways as well. It's the flattest and straightest place. That said, if you build another pipeline in that pathway or that corridor, you will still need to get the requisite right-of-way agreements from private landowners and from the feds where you cross BLM, for example, and you will have to do your NEPA process for your pipeline, regardless of the fact that there are existing pipelines. The existing pipelines might favor you getting a yes answer in the long run, but they don't by their existence preordain a yes.
All right. Thank you. Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because you touch on it, is that in your experience more of like an environmental assessment process, or is it a full-blown EIS process?
Mr. Jeffries?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, for a pipeline, say, running the length of I-80 across Wyoming, giving the extent of BLM that you're likely to cross, you probably will have to go EIS rather than EA.
So obviously, Mr. Jeffries, some long delays if you want to run another pipeline.
Mr. Chairman, they can be long.
Yeah, that's.
Mr.
that was
Co-Chair.
That was my question. What's the time frame for something like that?
Mr. Co-Chair, Mr. Chairman, as we'll indicate when we talk about the WIPSI process, that was from start to finish with the BLM, I think a couple years, 3 years. I believe the Denbury's application for a CO2 pipeline from Riley Ridge in towards Casper was a process that ran about 2 years. I believe they had the opportunity to exercise or to use some expedited right-of-way process with the BLM that came into law just a few years back. But in any case, a couple of years, in part just to gather the data required to be responsive in an EIS and in your right-of-way application takes a lot of field work and time.
Other questions? So a question for the committee. Is this an issue we should take up further and continue to address?
Well, Mr. Chairman,
Mis-
our opening comments from the governor's office didn't seem like anything was broken. Started hearing about it because we brought it up. Any of these other gentlemen at the table were hearing a need to take this any further. This is the time.
But my Mr. Co-Chair, my error. We also have on our agenda is Mr. Obermueller with the Petroleum Association of Wyoming, and I think he was trying to hide, but he's up here now. So, and we also have PSC if they care to weigh in on the issue at some point. So, Mr. Obermueller, your thoughts.
Yeah, apologies, Mr. Chairman. It seems the committee is wanting to move on very fast this particular meeting.
We'll take whatever time we need.
We skipped yesterday's public testimony a couple of times as well, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I won't forget. You're on the agenda. I don't consider you public testimony yet.
I appreciate it. Pete Obermueller, the Petroleum Association of Wyoming. I was waiting for the PSC because, Mr. Chairman, the PSC is the governing authority for intrastate pipelines in Wyoming. So I was interested to hear what they had to say, but it seemed as though you were moving on. So I thought I'd better jump
No,
up.
we still have them on the list. They'll
Okay.
be up shortly.
Okay.
They're waiting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will truncate what I want to say so that I can listen to the PSC.
We can bring you back also, Mr. Obermueller.
Either way, so Mr. Chairman, So, yeah, I guess, Mr. Chairman, from our standpoint, to Mr. Luthe's comments about what industry wants and needs, I'm struggling I'm looking for the problem we're trying to solve, quite frankly. And pipelines, as was alluded to, pipelines are by far the safest mode of transport for oil, natural gas, and for CO2 by leaps and bounds. 13 times safer than trains or trucks. There's something in the order of 5,200 miles of CO2 pipeline in the nation. There's about 560 miles of CO2 pipeline in Wyoming. In terms of the CO2 pipelines in Wyoming, not a single reportable event in their life. Pipelines are just liquid pipelines are it's basically as I've read, you're more likely to get struck by lightning twice than to be hurt by anything that happens with a pipeline. They are extraordinarily safe, and we're in this kind of interesting moment right now, a little bit where people are questioning the safety of it, despite all facts to the contrary. I think so. I'm struggling to when we talk about regulation of pipeline, I'm struggling to find the problem we're trying to solve by regulation. So to Representative Lawley's question on what do you do if you want to build an intrastate pipeline? Who do you go to? The answer is you have to go to a lot of different entities already. It depends on where the pipeline is. So if the pipeline goes across BLM or Forest Service, you have them to deal with. If it goes across state lands, you've got to get temporary use permits for state land. If it goes across private lands, then you have to, of course, get private land permission and go through all of that. And it was mentioned that counties are involved, and that is true. In fact, we're dealing with one right now. Somewhat thorny in Converse County on temporary water lines, not CO2 related, but temporary water lines that we're trying to figure out with the county. It is true that there could be a patchwork, but it's also true that a lot of these intrastate, so short lines, maybe temporary shorter lines, have very localized issues. So you may not be able to even if you were to do some sort of statewide regulation, they're probably going to have some sort of local implications that need to be solved at the county level anyway. So I'll just leave it at that. The answer to the question of who do in terms of inspections and safety, the answer for intrastate is the Wyoming PSC. They just instituted some new regulations for type C. So there's inspections related to those safeties every 2 years. Companies do that in various ways, but those are governed by the PSC. I would mention, I think, in terms of if there is a safety issue related to pipelines, Mr. Chairman, I would say it is the somewhat spotty and limited success of Wyoming's One Call program. Everybody wants to be exempt from the One Call program. And unfortunately, the legislature has abided some of those. And that's a pretty big threat. Is not having to find out where pipelines are before you dig. People have come with various, including me, Mr. Chairman, when I ran the County Commission Association, I wanted de minimis county road work exempt from 811, thinking, what's the big deal? I've learned that was probably the wrong approach. Anyway, that if you're asking if my opinion about perhaps a threat to safety is probably making sure that the 811 program is robust.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. A question? Go ahead, Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Obermueller, as always, helpful comments. I know for myself, I'm not really, my first instinct is not to jump to regulation. My first instinct is to understand what we have in place. And for me, the reason to look at this has more to do with infrastructure, adequacy, and are the processes good for those that want to come in and develop pipelines to extend their businesses perhaps. And my interest is more than that. Do you have any thoughts on the infrastructure issue, like as it concerns pipelines? Like, is there something we could be doing better to make that process more understandable, make that process more business friendly in a way, but keeping safety in mind at the same time? So that's really has a lot more to do with mine and the idea of I like to understand something before I comment on it.
Mr. Obermiller?
I appreciate that, Representative Lawley. Yeah, I mean, well, let me ask you through you, Mr. Chairman. Are you talking about from an investment standpoint, or are you talking about from is it perhaps that companies are looking around and wondering how do we get projects advanced? What are you asking?
Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermiller, it really is the idea of being business friendly in Wyoming. And we know that in the energy industry and others as well, that these pipelines are very important. And so really just understanding what would have to go through, whether it's somebody like Exxon doing expansion somewhere and they need to, those kinds of things. So it really is just generalized in terms of as a part of a business plan, someone needs to extend a pipeline, put in a new pipeline. Are we making it easy to go through that process, keeping safety in mind, but as far as the streamline administratively, is that something? I know we have these gaps where you different jurisdictions. I understand that, but is there something we should be looking at? And so I want to hear from you, kind of like the governor said, what the office said, that is there something that would help for those businesses you represent that would need that, either that are already existing or want to come into Wyoming?
Mr. Obermiller?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lawley, I really appreciate the question. And I'm trying to think about it in the context of what we're talking about here today is regulation and what I mentioned about localized impacts and perhaps there is a path there. I think and I want to be both careful and honest. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face in terms of building new pipeline infrastructure is making sure that landowners are at the table in a reasonable way. That is making the Powder River Basin very, very challenging. That's two-way street. Everybody has to work really hard on that and sit in the same room and have uncomfortable conversations and all of that. I don't know that the state can necessarily solve that apart from the general support for that product development and project completion and all of that is very dependent on cooperation of everybody. So this Converse County water line I mentioned is that's part of it. Is that's we talked about it yesterday, and I was thinking about this the whole time about the produced water and use of recycling water and all of that. And Converse County works so hard in the EIS to promote recycled water, but there is a disincentive for landowners to promote recycled water because that means that my members will not buy fresh water from them. So these sorts of challenges kind of butt up against each other. And so I don't mean to ramble on about this. I'm obviously thinking about it as I'm talking, but I don't see in terms of some sort of silver bullet from a regulatory standpoint where we could go that would be helpful.
Mr. Chairman. Representative Tarver.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Obermiller, I got a couple different types of questions for you. How about deregulating? Is there any ideas there to help this out? And then something that's always interested me is these EIS. So we have a corridor with pipelines and we have to do an EIS every time we put another pipeline in. So literally we do an EIS right behind the EIS we just did. Is there no way we can use one EIS for multiple lines over multiple years? Because is something changing here that I don't see? So if you can clarify any of those things.
Mr. Obermiller and anyone else that wants to speak to that one.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, Representative Tarpon, thank you. The trouble with who decides whether it's an EA or an EIS is not really in our hands. It's either in how cooperative the federal government wants to be, and or whether the courts tell them which one it is. So it's EISs are part of the NEPA process, which is project specific. So if you have a project that's multiple pipelines, you do an EIS and it's all that stuff. If separate projects, separate companies, separate timing, then you're forced into that structure, which is not a very helpful or healthy structure currently. But that's a federal issue, unfortunately. And the counties and us and the state and others are continually pushing on streamlining that NEPA process. Governor has been very helpful on that. That's a lifetime process, unfortunately. So on that one, very little we can do. On the deregulatory side, I don't think when I say I'm searching for a problem, I kind of include that too in this conversation, because I don't see, and maybe my members will correct me, there's several of them in the room who might want to come up and say, but at least as it relates to intrastate, there's nothing happening there that I think that's overly burdensome either. We've talked about some of the CO2 sequestration stuff at DUQ, and I think we're at a decent balance there. It's a long process. But we're working through those.
Okay, Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermueller, I guess since we're having this whole discussion about pipelines, regulation, deregulation, what needs to be done, maybe just as a refresher for the committee, or certainly for myself, what was the last pipeline that was built, and what was the experience of the developer? I mean, was it from the interactions at the state level, did things go relatively well? I'd be curious, because that can kind of give us an anchor point about what was their experience, what went wrong, and is there things that we can do to address that and make it easier? So I don't know, if it was Enbridge or whoever it was, but if you know off the top of your head, what was the last one and what was their experience like?
Mr. Obermueller?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, maybe Mr. Jeffries has a institutional knowledge about that. I don't know.
Mr. Jeffries?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, short answer is not that I recall in terms of any entity having a specific problem with Wyoming. The last two large pipelines that come to mind were an NGL pipeline constructed that ran from North Dakota down through the eastern half of the state, running north to south to move NGLs onto Oklahoma and Texas. That was built by ONEOK. I don't recall them having significant issues, certainly nothing that made it to the press. And prior to that, interstate natural gas pipeline projects running down the I-80 corridor have generally run the FERC process, which is the lead agency for the NEPA process, without anything particular to a project that comes to mind as an issue.
Thank you. And go ahead, Mr. Luther.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and just some general comments. Representative Tarver, excellent points. Unfortunately, I mean, ideally, like the Pipeline Corridor Initiative, when that was done, you did a big EIS. You identified an area where pipelines, would be acceptable to go. That ideally, then that lessens the time necessary to do whatever the next process is as each pipeline comes in. Unfortunately, and Senator Ellis, you picked up on this, and I'd also like to thank you for your years of service. So thank you so much. This becomes very political at the federal level. We were never political at the state level, but at the federal level, it does particularly so, as winners, choosers are often selected through that process of how many EISs, how many EAs do you have to do? So sometimes what that means, it's a change of administration can often make a lot of difference. Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, also thank you for your service as well on this committee and within the legislature. But again, excellent points as we look at there. We can't do much about the federal. Our office will continue to try and get the agencies to be more cooperative, to do fewer or streamline or at least combine the EIS. this is going way off topic, but let me just give you one example of the Natrium project, currently planned for Kemmer. Between DOE and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we expect they're going to have to go through about 7 environmental analysis. Does that make sense? Not at all. One should be able to cover it, maybe 2 for 2 federal agencies. All I can tell you is we'll continue to push on that. And so I would say the most, when we talk about, I think the safety of pipelines has really been the concern for safety, as Pete Obermuller mentioned, maybe just over exaggerated, but the question, the 2 scariest initials when we deal with this are ED, eminent domain. So, thank you.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Luthi. So let's get the PSC up here if they want to weigh in on this too. And for staff, Brian, do you recall who asked to have this put on the interim topic list?
Mr. Luthi.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I believe it was the governor's office.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to be clear.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for bringing that up again.
I was happy to bring that up too, because when we opened this up, I said, are you hearing much about, and we would want the governor's office to track it. And Mr. Obermuller, before you leave the table, have you connected the problem solution situation yet? I'm not sure that we have. You're telling us that things are running well. For the most part, we need some corrections. We got to get that one call situation followed up on perhaps. But and before you leave the table, what's your summary statement?
Mr. Obermuller, and you can come back after PSC speaks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah. I appreciate that. Yeah, I just, with respect to having to add new statewide regulations for pipelines of any kind, I don't think we're at that point. I haven't connected that. Is really my honest answer.
Okay.
Now, maybe the PSC will have some interesting insights here in terms of what they feel like their role is on safety and construction inspections and those sorts of things. And I'm frankly, I'm quite interested to hear what they have to say about that as well. So,
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. So, gentlemen. Proceed.
Chairman Burkhart, Co-Chairman Dockstader, thank you for having us. My name is John Burbridge. I'm Secretary and Chief Counsel for the Public Service Commission. With me today is Commissioner Robinson. Mary Throne is observing and I think is set up to participate remotely. But somehow I've been delegated the task of addressing the CO2 pipelines. We really don't have too much to say other than to clarify what Mr. Luthi was saying. The big question is whether, as you want to look at this, is whether the Public Service Commission has jurisdiction over CO2 pipelines. Currently, the Public Service Commission has not exercised jurisdiction over CO2 pipelines, and the law seems to be unclear as to whether we have that jurisdiction or not. The other issue that's been discussed this morning is pipeline safety and safety inspections. Currently, PHMSA has jurisdiction over the safety inspections and safety of CO2 pipelines, and the Public Service Commission does not have authority to perform those safety jurisdictions or safety inspections, excuse me. And then the last thing I would note is that we certainly have no objection if, as a policy matter, or if this discussion continues, of having the law clarified to give the Public Service Commission jurisdiction over CO2 pipelines. We currently do not regulate or do any citing certificate of public convenience of necessity work with CO2 pipelines. And so, the question is, is it beneficial to have the Public Service Commission involved in that capacity, or is less regulation better? So with that, we would stand for questions. Thank you.
Questions? Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you said that there's not a lot of clarity about your ability to regulate these CO2 pipelines. I guess the question would be, I mean, if we did do it, what would be enabling you to regulate? Is it the transmission of CO2 through the pipeline? Is it the building component? I mean, I think we say to regulate CO2 pipelines is a pretty broad phrase, right? Is it is it the leak type of situation or safety situation? So, I asked that of what would that entail? Because I agree in the sense that if there is no problem, is this ambiguity inherently bad?
Mr. Burbidge?
Chairman Burkhart, Representative Western, thank you for the question. I think one of the things that would have to be explored is if the Public Service Commission was involved to the extent of looking at construction projects prior to see if there was a necessity for that pipeline, it may have an impact on condemnation proceedings. That very often a determination of a necessity for a utility project like a pipeline does, I think, benefit the developer of that. It helps them out if they need to exercise their condemnation proceedings to be able to construct that pipeline. And then it is a question currently with other pipelines that we do regulate. We've pretty much streamlined the rate regulation so that the rates that are charged are consistent with what the interstate rates are. We don't have a whole lot of intrastate rate intrastate movements that are rate regulated under the state rates that are set. And that's just because I think it's been easier for the pipeline operators to default to the federal rate. So.
Follow up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the clarification, and just, I feel in these committee situations, I just reveal my ignorance here, but my understanding was that with the PSC, it's just you're regulating the rates in a retail setting, big utility selling to retail customers versus you've got, sophisticated parties that are buying and selling CO2, through these pipelines. Was my understanding correct?
Chairman Burkhart, Representative Western, that's essentially correct. And I'm going to warn all of the committee members here today that my focus generally hasn't been on pipelines for quite some time. It's been kind of a quiet thing. And a lot of that is because you've got sophisticated parties that are negotiating the movements of the materials in the pipeline. And like I said, they generally are using the federal rates anyway. We have not had a rate case in front of us on to set pipeline rates in quite some time. So there hasn't been a lot of controversy with that, and it is the retail rates. And also we look at those rates where the companies are moving materials for third parties at a retail rate. So.
Okay. Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of the conversation this morning has been about safety and pipeline safety and how we can oversee that and make sure that we don't miss anything with some CO2 pipelines. And as the PSC does a lot of auditing of DOT pipelines and some of the other products with periodic inspections, both monitoring the cathodic protection, the internal and external inspections whenever they're uncovered. So there's a myriad of things that you guys do to ensure the safety of our pipelines. We have some existing pipelines in the state of Wyoming that have been there for 40 years. Have they not been maintained, or have they not been audited, or is there not any surveillance on them as far as cathodic protection or inspections or anything like that that we do with these other pipelines currently?
Mr. Burbidge?
Chairman Burkhart, Representative Heiner, I'm getting out over my skis on this one. I'd have to get back to you with an answer on that. I'm reasonably certain that our engineers that inspect the pipelines they're on a regular schedule, and they also look at the cathodic protection. And my assumption is that it's for all pipelines that are currently active and not abandoned that are being operated in the state that we have safety jurisdiction over.
Follow up?
Follow up.
So if we changed some of the rules and regulations to give you additional authority over CO2 pipelines and clarified that, would it take additional manpower or additional efforts on your part to be able to extend over these other pipelines?
Chairman Burkhardt, Representative Heiner, as I sit here, I don't know for sure, but because I think the total number of miles of CO2 pipeline, it might not. But our inspectors are stretched pretty thin, and I would have to consult with our supervising engineer because he's responsible for scheduling those inspections and actually performs a lot of those himself. So as I sit here, maybe not, but I don't want to be committed to that answer.
Okay. Question? So, Mr. Burbidge, which pipelines, just for clarification, do you regulate, do you administer?
Chairman Burkhardt, my understanding is that we have safety jurisdiction over the liquid pipelines. And Mr. McCollum tells me this all the time, and I always have to ask him again, but I'm reasonably certain that it's that I do know, because I just asked him based on the conversation this morning, that we do not have any safety jurisdiction over the CO2 pipelines.
Okay. All right. Okay. Mr. Obermueller, I told you I'd give you another chance, so please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the conversation on the inspections. I think that is important. And that does happen on a routine basis. And also, let me just use this opportunity to plug some of the just really fascinating new technology with respect to leak detection and pipeline safety that's happening in Wyoming, well, nationwide, but some stuff that's happening specifically in Wyoming. I think I mentioned this at the Energy Authority event a week ago or so, that there's a company in Casper that has developed AI technology that is so good at detecting anomalies in pipeline structure, and then also what's happening with the flow rate and all that. It can detect anomalies at such fine detail that what their challenge is determining when do we send a person out to look, because they can see every little tiny thing that's going that could potentially go wrong in a predictive way. So from a leak standpoint, that's just one among many. These forgetting what they stand for, somebody might shout it out. I think they're called PIGs, I think, pipeline integrity something. They're essentially little capsules that run through the pipeline and do the same thing, detect any sort of differences in the width of the pipeline, any corrosion, any of those sorts of things that happen quite often, but certainly under the PSC's jurisdiction from an inspection standpoint. So with that aside, I would just note with regard to PHMSA's authority on CO2. The way I understand it is even if it's a smaller feeder line that runs into a pipeline that is interstate, that still qualifies under PHMSA regulation and inspection regimes. So in terms of the CO2 pipeline currently in Wyoming, and probably the only CO2 pipeline in Wyoming for quite some time, at least up until the Southeast Wyoming project is completed, PHMSA is the authority. And as was mentioned there under, they should be releasing a proposed rulemaking here probably this month.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Okay, let's open it to public testimony. Anyone here wish to speak on the issue of pipelines? Okay, anyone remotely? Last chance. Okay, I'll close public testimony on that. So committee, I'm not sure. It sounds to me like we have a solution to a problem that we don't even know what the problem is. Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I think that's where it's at. We heard from Mr. Obermueller, the governor's office, not a lot of action here. Some small corrective measures, but I don't know that we need to jump into anything large.
Okay. Any other representative, or I'm sorry, Senator Ellis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think my concern is what's happening outside of Wyoming. You know, I was following an issue that's been years in the making in St. Louis where they were trying to expand some pipe to, you know, better meet the fuel demands in St. Louis. And boy, did that get political at the federal level. I mean, dozens of articles written about it. I know Lower Valley Energy had, and I don't know where the status of that is, but there was a project to expand some natural gas on the west side of the state. And that crossed federal lands. And I think there were concerns about sage grouse. And so I think, to me, that's always the question, is what's happening maybe within our state, but externally, that makes pipeline, you know, expansion more difficult, which would impact us. So, you know, when I saw this on the agenda, I kind of thought we were going to go that route. But I don't think we need to do anything, but I do think as a committee, we need to be very mindful of what's happening around us that impacts what happens in our state.
Senator, I think you kind of hit it right on the head with our involvement in this. So with no other discussion, just no motions or anything, go ahead.
No
Mr.
motion,
Coach.
just a quick clarification. Lower Valley Energy Project is moving ahead. We moved off of federal land onto private land.
Okay, with that, we will move on and not create problems where they don't exist. So next up, similar topic is Pipeline Corridor Initiative. And I see that Mr. Jeffries just stayed there. He knew he'd be back up anyway. And we've been joined by Director Whitman. Morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Proceed.
We're pleased to bring to your attention, or back to your attention, the Wyoming Pipeline Corridor Initiative that was mentioned earlier. With the big support and help from Brian Jeffries, who is our commercial pipeline advisor who works for EORI now.
I'm going to interrupt you for just a minute. Mr. Burbidge, will you be back for this afternoon's discussion? Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Whitman, please proceed.
No problem. We just thought it would be good to get this back on your radar and the work that was done with the Wyoming Pipeline Corridor Initiative, which really was launched back 2008 or 9. Quite a lot of work is done. So I asked Mr. Jeffries to join me and actually present to you just an overview and maybe answer some of your questions. I may make one comment with Representative Western's question. I believe the latest, or perhaps the last pipeline CO2 related, was the Denbury line, Green Core line from Casper up to Gillette and further into North Dakota, into Montana. That was in 2012 and 13, and that went in with little to no public anything. They had no issues, no problems. So I think that is probably the last pipeline that went in. Anyway, I'll turn this over to Mr. Jeffries.
Mr. Jeffries.
Mr. Chairman, we can go to the first slide, please, or next slide. So I promised, Mr. Chairman, that I'm not a bullet reader. But I would call your attention to the blue text at the top. That's taken from the record of decision related to the WIPC application. And another way of putting that sentence is WIPC was an effort to take some shot at chopping away the Gordian knot about building pipeline projects across multiple jurisdictions, including multiple BLM field offices, trying more than a decade ago to start the process of facilitating pipeline construction in Wyoming, recognizing things take time. And so that was the purpose of the WIPC project. Nearly all of the BLM field offices in Wyoming, I believe 9 of the 10, had existing corridors in their resource management plans for pipeline activities. They weren't necessarily coordinated. So the goal was to rationalize, coordinate, make sure we had adequate capacity in those corridors, and put something in place that would be on the shelf for projects that would come later, and take the burden off an individual pipeline project to try and correct deficiencies that existed across the system. Next one, please. Yeah, it's needed or was needed because you can't build any material pipeline in Wyoming other than on the very eastern edge of the state where you're not going to need a BLM right-of-way grant for which you're going to have to do some level of NEPA process. So it's an unavoidable action in order to get your pipeline built to deal with the BLM. As I said, 9 of the 10 offices were involved. Only Newcastle was not involved in this. Next one. So there were corridors in the resource management plans of each of the other 9 field offices. They've been there for a very long time. The concept of corridors was not something created by WIPSI. Our efforts, or the effort by the state of Wyoming to coordinate them is something that otherwise I don't believe would have occurred until some project had to take the burden on for themselves. And to the extent the corridors don't match, the photo there is meant to be a somewhat humorous depiction of it. I assure you that is a photoshopped photo. Nobody ever actually made that mistake. Here's an example as we are down in the southwest corner of the state. Various field offices are shaded different colors, and you see corridors. If you think of field offices of having fence lines, you see corridors running up to the fence line and stopping and with nothing on the other side. My other characterization for that is if I-25 stopped at the Colorado-Wyoming border in Wyoming and then took up in Colorado 40 miles to the east. The practicality certainly would not be there. So this was, the problem statement. How do you go about correcting this when you have to corral all of those field offices under one process to get it done? So the process was to sit down and, particularly with the assistance of the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute, figure out where do you want to go from and where to, so you can start getting initial routes selected. You go out and start assessing the impacts that you have to address if you're going to build a comprehensive system. You hire professionals to help you identify the reports you're going to need to submit a proper application to the BLM. You sit down with the BLM and go through how will this be done? What will you require of the applicant, in this case, the state of Wyoming, to do this? And then you hire the consultants to prepare the additional work required for the environmental impact statement. And an EIS was required for this because of the scope of the project. To give you some idea of the boxes you have to check or the considerations you have to deal with, I've just grabbed a few of them onto the slide. Fish and wildlife, special status species like sage grouse, geology, heritage, cultural resources, things like National Historic Trails, travel management designations. Frankly, until I became involved in this, I had no idea there were so many specific things. Wilderness study areas became a big deal in this analysis, backcountry byways. So this is 8 that I've listed. There were actually 20. So the process of trying to resolve the discontinuity of these corridors into a unified set, you can't please all 20 criteria. And so you get into big trade-off games of, where do you assign importance to get the best outcome and still meet the requirement to have multiple uses on BLM lands. But 20 different criteria to sort of sift through in the EIS process, or at least in this particular process. So the timeline for the project, we officially kicked it off following several years of unofficial discussion when the legislature appropriated $2 million from AML funds to pay for the work required for consultants to move through this. The BLM ran the public outreach process. There were public meetings held in Cheyenne, Casper, Thermopolis, and Rock Springs on the project. County, state, local, county, tribal authorities were all contacted and offered the opportunity to be consulting agencies or I don't think consulting agency is the right word, but participating partners in the process. 21 of those entities joined in the process. So this was done with the typical broad outreach that is required when you go through the NEPA process, and certainly for Wyoming with the affected parties. So 8 years later and $2 million later, you get a record of decision. So now the corridors that were established will become part of the individual resource management plans of those 9 field offices. This is a map, and this map is also available on the Enhanced Oil Recovery's website of pipelines, and you can drill down to further detail. You're not stuck with a map that's statewide, so you can scroll in. There's 2 kinds of corridors. One was 300-foot wide. The others were done 200-foot wide. This is with the idea that more than one pipeline is possibly going to be built within these corridors. And we didn't want to make it something that became a one-off availability. So in evaluating where to put the corridors, we looked at where are the sources, where do you want to come from? So they're shown on the chart and in your packet. Something I'll comment, you'll look at the map and go, see, it seems like the corridor is a little disjointed because corridors just stop. Particularly as you're in the central to southeast corner of the state. That's because you run out of BLM land. So this project was to do corridors on the BLM. So that's why if you look at it and go, there's nothing that leads out to the Laramie River plant. And that's because you don't have to cross the BLM to get to the Laramie River plant. It's not a failure to recognize that it's a potential source. But our audience and our application in this case was with the BLM. And the next slide is the same, except the current and proposed CO2 enhanced oil recovery projects that are in the state are added to it, just to add to the flavor of sources and sinks. So now that this is done, what's it good for? By aligning the corridors, it cuts down the time and expense for a project that would span more than one field office. It unfortunately does not do away with a requirement for an individual project to go through the NEPA process for its own project. It hopefully makes the gauntlet easier or shorter, but it doesn't eliminate it. It did not create a right-of-way owned by the state or anyone else. So a project using these corridors will still need an application for its own specific right-of-way. A couple items to remember: that the space is first come, first serve. There's no established pref right for any entity to use these corridors. The corridors can be used for any compatible use. And compatible use is discussed in the record of decision, and it runs along the lines of other things that fit in a corridor, like another pipeline, things like that. It didn't identify directly incompatible resources, so I couldn't name one other than, I guess you can't build a runway down the corridor. But grazing, recreational uses, and all those are all compatible uses, so it doesn't preempt those. Really, the next step in the whole process is there is a project going on. It's second bullet from the bottom, the Wyoming Trails Carbon Hub, which is an effort to take these corridors, to take the sources and sinks, and try to imagine in the future what a coherent, well-planned pipeline corridor system would look like, so that you can start to calculate what would the rates look like, what would service on a pipeline system that served all of these sources and sinks need to look like to actually function. It suggests a fair amount of clairvoyance in deciding how it would get built out. And not all these corridors are going to be used. They're all there available for use. They do a lot to, for example, unlock access to the Bighorn Basin. And so, a number of them will be, but their existence does not imply that there will certainly be a pipeline in that corridor someday. So, it was back to the goal started well over a decade ago for the state of Wyoming to deal with known burdens on developing pipelines in Wyoming, take it upon itself to take the steps to try to knock down, even though not capable of eliminating, issues that go with development of pipeline projects. And it's, I think, going to be very effective for the state. I'm not aware of any other state that has done anything like this to try to plow the road a bit for projects that would come along in the state's interest in the future. And Mr. Chairman, happy to answer any questions.
Right. And before we get to questions, just a statement from the chair. During last interim and during session, we had some legislation dealing with enhanced oil recovery, CO2, and realized that, one of the bottlenecks we have is infrastructure. Can we get captured CO2 from a power plant to where it's needed for enhanced oil recovery? So this topic I put on in conjunction with the industry, oil and gas industry, put on the interim topics. So do we need to do more? Are we adequate? Because we have to address that infrastructure issue, or there's no sense talking about using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery if, in effect, you have two stranded assets that can't communicate with each other in some manner. So that's the reason for the discussion. So questions from the committee? Okay, Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jeffries, I appreciate all that you've done over the years for the state of Wyoming in these various capacities and roles you've had, because it's amazing that we have a collaboration where the federal government has acknowledged our corridors, and that is being integrated into their resource management plans now. So that is a step change, and it will promote our resource development in years to come. And I appreciate all that you've done. But following up with the chairman's comments, we have a lot of CO2 available. And with the 45Q tax credits, it promotes storage rather than utilization with the different tax credits. And so we want to utilize that CO2 for enhanced oil recovery as much as possible. But our CO2 pipelines are at capacity right now. So it's an issue of getting more pipelines in the ground. So with your expertise and knowledge, Mr. Jeffries, is there anything that our legislature could do to incentivize additional capacity in infrastructure, CO2 pipelines, to get that CO2 transported throughout the state to where it is needed, to enhance oil recovery such that we can promote the resource development and continue the development of that oil recovery?
Mr. Jeffries?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Heiner, I'm familiar with the work of this committee in the last interim session to try and level the playing field between permanent storage and enhanced oil recovery uses with respect to the 45Q credits. Beyond that, nothing immediately comes to mind, because the issue in building pipelines is having credit-worthy users of the pipeline who are willing to commit to pay tariffs to justify the capital expenditure. And in that statement, it's hard to pick out a place for the state other than granting money, which I think there are constitutional issues with, to building the pipelines. So I'm back to my short answer of nothing that I can point to that is particularly helpful.
Okay, other questions? Mr. Co-Chair.
Sir, when you say credit worthy, we don't have people out there or organizations, companies that are set up to make this work.
Mr. Jeffries, maybe an explanation of your terminology.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, when I use that term, I'm referring to sort of the model of building natural gas and NGL pipelines and crude oil pipelines. So the builders of those pipelines are certainly creditworthy entities. They undertake projects when they can sign up enough customer support to pay rates over time to return their capital. And in that, they look at the customer's creditworthiness because they want the customer to be around for the life of the contract, not the life of the company, whichever comes first. So it does, in some cases, frustrate some parties' abilities to help support pipelines, because if your balance sheet isn't sufficient to make you creditworthy in the eyes of the pipeline company, they're not going to take you on as a customer and count on your support for the capital recovery of that project. So when I say creditworthy, I mean the credit quality of the customer signing up for service.
Thank you. Other questions? Representative Lawley and then Representative Tarver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jeffries, thank you for being here and thank you for this presentation. It was really helpful along the lines of some things I've been wondering about. And I live in the Bighorn Basin, so well understand the BLM dilemma, so to speak. And I want to applaud you on the work that was done. And again, mindful of it, it took a decade really to accomplish it, but a great accomplishment. But I want to go back to your comments to Representative Heiner about what we can do. And I want to make sure that I understood. He talked about the leveling up. We brought up the leveling up on the 45Q, some of the work we did last session. And I heard you correctly that you feel that would be the thing that could incentivize then the folks that would want to use that pipeline to come in perhaps and be part of wanting to, if they needed it, develop a new pipeline that would create that interest in that possibility. Is that correct? Am I understanding that correctly?
Mr. Jeffries.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lawley, my understanding of that process in the last session was exactly that, to improve the economic value of using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, to put it on par with the other. I do want to add one comment about the Wyoming Corridor project, that the real shout out goes to a lot of people, but there was a gentleman named Matt Fry who came to the Pipeline Authority from originally the Game and Fish Commission, or Game and Fish Department, who was really the person that ramrodded that project through its Pipeline Authority. And if there's credit strongly put on one person, I would certainly direct it to Matt Fry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Representative Tarver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You answered a lot of my questions. Previously, it looks like you've already taken that bull by the horns and got a lot done for us. I appreciate that. So back to the 2012, 2013 was our last major pipeline. And maybe you guys can answer this, maybe not. Our costs at that time per mile, per foot, per whatever, I don't know how it was ran out, but what are our expenses at now if we wanted to do the exact same pipeline? And then also, if we want to incentivize further pipelines, is there something we could do perhaps, because we talked about taxes till I almost passed out yesterday. Maybe there's something we can do there to incentivize our pipeline people to put some pipelines in.
Mr. Jeffries.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Tarver. God, my mind has just gone blank. Oh, cost of pipelines. Pipeline costs are often described in a sort of industry insider unuseful unit, but I'll use it. It's called the dollars per inch mile. So if you say it's $50,000 per inch mile, and you're building a 12-inch pipeline, then your pipeline is going to cost $50,000 times 12 per mile, or $600,000. So that's the sort of dimensionless unit of price. So if you go back about 15 years, building a pipeline in the West without special considerations, you're not going up and down a 40-degree slope or something, you might be talking in the range of $50,000 per inch mile. Construction costs, materials costs, probably run that number up around $120,000 to $140,000 per inch mile now. So in simple terms, that's a slightly doubling or more in the cost of constructing a pipeline over the last 15 years.
Okay.
You're correct. I'm at
Representative Tarver. Okay. All right. Other questions? Okay. Questions? All right. Thank you. With that, I'll open up to public comment. Mr. Obermueller.
Mr. Chairman, Pete Obermueller, Petroleum Association. I'm going to endeavor to be less curmudgeonly. Appreciate this conversation.
I will too.
Appreciate you all. With respect, before it slips my mind to Mr. Jeffries talking about the bills from last year, both the EOR one, but also the unitization one. I just want to thank this committee. You all had to carry that water in some interesting conversations about how important those were. I don't think those bills that the bill that passed, I don't think it passed. It would have passed without you all engaging with your colleagues about the importance of that. That was pretty incredible, and I really appreciate that. And while I'm doing your public thanks on the pipeline corridor initiative, I think it's important to say publicly that I don't think POW was not terribly helpful in that regard. We had some what I think is some short-sighted views about the pipeline corridor initiative, and I think we were wrong. And so I think it's important to say that publicly and thank Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Fry in particular for their work on that. I think that is a model that could be followed elsewhere in terms of doing these programmatic EISs that at least knock down one hurdle, if not all the hurdles moving forward. So I really appreciate and Mr. Whitman, of course, and everybody who worked on that. So a couple things on what we could do. First of all, I would ask the committee to formally revisit SF-78, the enhanced oil recovery bill that that one failed in the Senate just by one vote on the introduction vote. So it didn't really get a debate on the merits. And, I think there are some, as you all know, there's some merits. There are some meritorious arguments about ways to do that differently. So Representative Tarver, you'll recall that bill was we don't need to delve into too much, but it tried to close that gap by having Wyoming use severance tax money to frankly subsidize sending CO2 towards EOR projects. Some have said perhaps an easier way to do that is to just say, if you're going to do EOR in Wyoming and you're going to use a CO2 source from Wyoming, that you just cut the severance tax by 3%. That is easier, has a little bit less constitutional question, may be more palatable to some people in the House and Senate, but not others who don't love that idea. So regardless, I would ask that the committee revisit that and we try again in a general session when we can debate that on the merits in the House and the Senate as opposed to an introductory vote. That'd be number one. Number two. Yesterday, you all discussed the idea of a tax exemption on laydown facilities. That did not get. There was not a motion from the committee to ask that a bill be drafted on that. I don't think that anyone stood up to talk about it at the time. So forgive me, but I'll revisit that and just ask that you move to draft that bill as you talked about yesterday, so that bill could be that idea could be discussed on its merits as well. Then let me just mention a couple of things that would really hinder new pipeline projects, no matter what they are. Number one, any sort of new broad taxation scheme that just increases sales tax as a trade-off for property. That would be just a straight tax increase on pipelines and would make it difficult. Number two, and I hate to bring it up, but it is true. Any changes to Wyoming's eminent domain statute would be dagger. So I just offer that word of caution on that one as well. I think I'll leave it at that. Trying to think if I missed something. I don't think so, but I'll happy to take questions.
Questions, Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermueller, we have only a limited number of EOR fields in Wyoming that are actually active right now. And they were converted to EOR by major oil companies, not the little small oil companies, because the cost is tremendous to put in stainless steel flow lines and all the infrastructure that's required to go to CO2 injection. Now, many of these fields that we've targeted, and we saw on the presentation from Mr. Jeffries, they're owned and operated by smaller oil companies, not the majors. To take on that kind of an endeavor, and as a legislature, we would love to see more EOR opportunities come to fruition. But for a small producer, that it's something that they can't tackle. The mountain is too steep. So we have some grant opportunities, some funds available through the state, some loans or bonding. What can we do to help promote this getting off of the center line and helping these smaller producers tackle that monster of converting a field to an enhanced oil recovery?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative High, I really appreciate that question, and I'll defer to my friend Mr. Whitman, who is really the expert on EOR and can talk more about that. You're totally right. These projects are big. They're big projects. To do an EOR project is not a small endeavor. It's very expensive, and its payback is long term. So you have to be in a position where you can maintain that project in that field for quite some time before you get that payback. I honestly, I don't know that there's a way, depending on the direction of the field and who owns it and what their goal is, that there's a way to. It's just not going to work for everybody. Now, that is not to say that there are not significant EOR potential from companies that do have that ability right now, and the problem has been, there's no monocausal reason for it, but part of the problem has been that people, particularly these days, companies are competing for sources of CO2, and they're competing for places to put it. And the federal financial incentive is for permanent sequestration. That's okay. I'm not here to argue against that. But I think that Wyoming could step in to promote a productive use for CO2, as we've discussed. If a company is on the bubble about whether or not they can do it, something like that leveling the playing field, or if we just want to do a simple 3% a severance cut for EOR, that could move the needle. I don't know that there is a grant big enough that could move a small company. Like I see my friend Mr. Van Cleef in the back, who operates a very small field. I don't know if there's a grant big enough that could get him to do EOR. He'll tell me otherwise if that's not true. But
Follow up,
please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the ESG is it may be a problem. I don't know. You probably know more than that, Mr. Obermueller. But to do an enhanced oil recovery project is going to take a lot of funding and capital, and they'd have to go to financial institutions to get that. And we know that ESG is a problem for fossil fuels. So would it be beneficial if the state offered up a bonding opportunities for something like this, utilizing the strength of the state and our bonding to be able to help a small producer come up with that capital?
Mr. Obermueller?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Heyer, it's possible. And the Wyoming Energy Authority already does have bonding authority. The issue is it's not been used in large part because the private market was sufficient, and the rates were such that it was there was no reason to use the state bonding authority. That situation has changed a little bit, and so there may be some possibilities there that we could explore with the Energy Authority. And I'm certainly open to that. Mr. Whitman, do you have anything to add? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Mr. Whitman?
Mr. Chairman, I think it is good to point out on that map that you were referring to earlier, there is a very small operator that is in final stages for a CO2 EOR project. Up near Gillette, there's a little cluster of 3 Menalusa fields. He's got a history of working at Salt Creek for Anadarko, and prior to that, Howell Petroleum. TR Operating is the name of the company. The owner of that company, James Hume, he's been able to get private financing to complete the project, and it's at final stages. His currently working on a contract negotiation with Exxon. So there are ways to do this. I think keeping in mind small operator, small field, you have to have enough revenue that will come from the CO2 EOR project to justify going into the project. So we have lots of field options that are viable for EOR, but they need to be at a size level that would justify that kind of expenditure. His process to accomplish that payout was to put 3 fields together that are located very close to each other. This little 3-field cluster that provided some economic value for him that would justify the expenditure. Through that work last summer for Joint Minerals, putting together that CO2 upside report and working on the leveling the playing field, we mentioned this 3-field cluster at that time a year ago almost, and he is just waiting for a contract with Exxon. So I think some incentive, as in North Dakota, where they did reduce severance tax directly for enhanced oil recovery, might be a viable path to help the operator with some of the costs.
Mr. Obermuller?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, just one last thing that came to my mind to your question, Representative Heiner, is as you know, PAW stood up a little separate organization called the Wyoming Carbon Innovation Network last year. And that's been interesting. One of the surprising things, it wasn't in my intention, but one of the surprising things that's happened as a result of that network is it's become sort of a way for companies to connect people who have investment and financing that want to do projects, and people are doing projects and sources of CO2 and all that. That's been fun and interesting. But a theme has really developed in my conversations with particularly with investors with federal money or other private money, to your point on ESG, is that most of them are looking to spend money that does not do EOR. And that is where I think perhaps there's room for the state to step in and fill that void. I don't know what that is precisely. Maybe it's part of energy grants. Again, another conversation with the Wyoming Energy Authority as they're looking at new grants. How can the state sort of step in and fill the void and promote EOR? Because it's not going to take money away from sequestration projects. That's there. It's pretty clear in conversations I've had with quite a few investment opportunities.
Okay, Representative Tarver.
Chairman, thank you. Ms. Whitman, I got a curious question. I was talking to a young man one time and he was telling me about huff and puff process. And I'm just curious, is there any small operators, would there be any benefit that you've seen through that process so you don't have to have the pipeline infrastructure?
Director Whitman, and maybe for everyone here and the people watching live, if you would define what huff and puff is. I know what it is, but I'm not sure everyone else does.
Mr. Chairman, I'm glad to do that. The huff and puff basically is, you could even use trucked CO2. You would inject the CO2 into the well, let it sit, and then flow back. So it's huff and puff. And it's often used as a pilot type test to see if the CO2 EOR will be viable in the field. It's generally done in smaller fields where you have fewer number of wells and you can control adequately where that CO2 goes. Those have been done. They've done that in South Glenrock B unit, which is also being developed for a CO2 flood right now. The previous owner was Link Energy. Link did try huff and puff there. Current owner is Glenrock Energy. They're moving forward actually now with a full CO2 EOR project there. So the huff and puff can be more of a pilot type test, or because your cost to truck CO2 for a huff and puff is pretty pricey, but you could do it more realistically for a pilot type test.
All right. Any other questions? Any other comments? Okay. So Mr. Obermuller, Director, you've mentioned a number of things that the state could possibly do. Any other ideas, even maybe out of the box, so to speak, ideas or anything else? I think we need the infrastructure if we want to do EOR in a lot of portions of the state. Without the infrastructure, and I've worked on Huff and Puff projects, they aren't really economical. You can't make them really pay the expenses. Any other ideas while you're sitting there?
Mr. Chairman, I might mention one other area of the CO2 EOR that has been mentioned. I think I've mentioned it. We have brought it to your attention. And perhaps we could further the discussion and understanding of the blue oil concept. Part of the discussion that is ongoing about CO2 EOR storage versus dedicated storage. I think there's a number of points that it's important people understand that when you do CO2 EOR, you will fully store that CO2 at the end of the project. So this dedicated versus CO2 EOR back and forth, I think there are collaborative efforts. You need one for the other. There's times that in a CO2 EOR flood where you will shut down the field and you don't want to vent any CO2, which is where the CO2 dedicated hub, for instance, becomes vitally important. Because we're talking about these closed systems and you don't suddenly want to be venting if you're talking about a closed system. So you would need a dedicated storage site option for periods where the field is in shutdown for compressor maintenance, the things that they do regularly. So I see those working collaboratively. But what's often left out of the discussion, and there's been a lot of scientific work done both by Occidental and Denbury, to show that the oil you produced from CO2 EOR is what they term blue oil or net carbon negative. Through the full life cycle of the use of that oil, you inject and store more CO2 in the process of getting the barrel of oil out than will be emitted through the full use life of that barrel of oil. So you end up with a net negative carbon scenario. And I think that is something that we could develop and support both sides of that discussion on dedicated versus EOR. It's an added benefit to the state to have blue oil, and there are refineries that will pay a premium price for blue oil. There was a couple of articles that have been in the press, Oxy selling blue oil at a premium. I would suggest that we could increase that discussion about blue oil in Wyoming. That might be one area, Mr. Chairman, that we could work on. I don't know if Mr. Obermuller has some other thoughts.
Director Whitman, let me ask you, and if you would please, for the next committee meeting, prepare some information a little more detailed on that for us.
Mr. Chairman, I'd be glad to do that.
And then staff will put that on the agenda for next meeting. I think that type of information is helpful. I know that some of our gas producers in the western part of the state are getting a premium for producing what you would call green gas. So thank you if you would. So
Mr. Chairman, I'm glad to do that.
Mr. Obermuller, care to comment on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have anything further to add other than the two draft bills I would ask the committee to advance.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any other public testimony? Anyone else in the room? Anyone on virtual? Just so you don't feel left out, Representative Conrad, do you have any questions? You're muted. No, you're still muted. So shaking his head no, I assume that means no. I didn't want him to fall asleep. So we're glad to have you join us. Okay, so committee? Yes, Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would move to have Senate File 78, carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery stimulus, drafted for consideration at our next Minerals Committee meeting.
Okay, seconded. Okay. All in favor? Aye. Okay, I didn't think there needed to be any discussion on that. Mr. Obermuller, Mr. Whitman, I would ask you join in that. And if you think of things we might need to modify in there, change wording, we're a year down the road, things do change rapidly anymore. If you could let us know, let staff know. Okay. Yes, Representative Lawley.
I want to make a motion that we use the inventory exemption and have some. Oh,
Mike.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chairman, that we revisit the inventory tax exemption that we passed over yesterday. I think it was yesterday.
Second.
Okay, moved and seconded. Everyone understand that one?
Yep, Mr. Chairman, is that the concept of the kind of that tax-free zone?
Yes, Miss, yes.
All right, thank you,
Brian.
Mr. Chairman.
So, okay, any discussion on that? Okay, all in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Okay, that's adopted. So, let's see, motion, I can't do it. Motion that we bring back the House bill on the 3% severance reduction.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Larson.
I'd like to make a motion that we draft the 3% severance reduction bill.
Second.
Okay, seconded. That, yes, Representative or Senator Ellis, I apologize.
Some clarification. I thought my understanding was that would be in place of Senate File 78. Are those two similar or separate concepts?
Senator, they complemented each other, and the one that Representative Larson's proposing never made it to introduction. It was to be an alternative in case 78, Senate File 78 did not go through. However, by the time we decided it was a House bill to put that in, it was too late for introduction. And it was the one that Mr. Obermuller mentioned, which was a straight 3% reduction of severance tax, cut the severance tax in half. And I think they would just be, again, complementary, whichever, so to give the committee a choice, what the committee prefers. Okay, any other discussion? All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Okay. All right, so Brian, you have those three. All right, and those will be ready for next committee meeting. And Brian, I would ask that, any input you need from the committee or from industry or whoever, just go and get it. Okay. All right, so next is oil and gas bonding, and we're a few minutes behind, but I think it's a good time to take a 5-minute break, and that is 5 minutes. Okay. We're back. So next topic for discussion. Oil and gas bonding. So Brian, you gave us a good report and a topic summary. Would you go over that for the committee as a good place to start?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, I can do that. For efficiency, I'm happy to defer to Mr. Crowpatch. I think most of our information, this is 21-01. I would offer maybe a couple of observations.
Please.
Compared to, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, say the Environmental Quality Act, bonding in statute for oil and gas is much more limited. Statute expressly gives the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission authority to require the furnishing of a surety bond or other guarantee for securing the duty to plug each dry or abandoned well or the repair of wells. The only other real mention in statute, at least broadly speaking, is that statute defines what qualifies as a surety bond or other guarantee. And it's a surety bond, a first priority security interest in a deposit of a collected cashier's check, a first priority security interest in a certificate of deposit, or an irrevocable letter of credit. So those are the specified things. Otherwise, bonding for oil and gas is primarily through rules of the commission. Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to go into more detail, but for efficiency, I'm happy to defer as well.
We'll let Mr. Crowpatch, Director Crowpatch, address that. So, Director, proceed. You're on the hot seat now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do have some slides in my presentation that we've been looking at for various topics also on bonding. And if you have that in front of you and are following along, it starts on page 21 of my presentation that I had provided. Mr. Chairman, as Mr. Fuller stated, our authority for bonding does reside in statute. I won't repeat any of that. I will just note, in addition to bonding, to ensure the plugging and abandonment of wells, we also have authority to bond for the compliance with rules and orders of the commission. So we can bond for various reasons. I'll also mention various other parts of the statutes also address bonding for issues like split estate and geophysical or seismic projects and geophysical split estate as well. I think the purpose of today's discussion is more surrounding well bonding. So in the split estate and the seismic bonding, but I don't really go into more detail throughout the presentation on that, but more than happy to discuss any of that if there's questions related to those types of bonding. Page 22, as Mr. Fuller mentioned, our rules really provide most of the details on the bonding and what our requirements are. They're in Chapter 3, Section 4 of our regulations. And so we commonly request bonding for an operator blanket bond, idle well bonds, pits and reservoir bonds, as I mentioned, split estate, seismic bonds. We also do bonding for commercial class 2 disposal wells, or so the commercial disposal. And in lieu of bonding, in lieu of providing an operator blanket bond and idle well bonding, an operator can also just supply an individual well bond. And I'll go into some of those details. As Mr. Fuller mentioned, we accept sureties. We'll do letters of credit, certificates of deposit, and cashier's checks. We request bonding and we bond operators when we talk about well bonding for fee wells only, or the private wells. Office of State Lands and Investments does all of the well bonding on wells located on state land. So we do not do idle well bonding or operators bonds on state land wells. And the BLM does bonding for federal wells. And if you're following some of the federal regulations recently, they just recently published the final rule that the BLM fluid mineral leasing and leasing processes rule, which also significantly increases the bonding required from operators on federal wells. So maybe some of the discussion today will get into a little bit of that as well. In rare cases, and I can think of one time that we've done it in my 14 or 15 years with the commission, we can request an operator provide a bond for compliance. So we had asked an operator who we were having issues with compliance with rules on reporting to us and also paying various taxes to supply a bond because of their non-compliance. And the only wells they had within the state were federal wells. And we had no other bond or anything on them prior to that point. But because of their non-compliance with some of our rules, we were able to, we asked for a bond, and that actual ask was affirmed by district court when the operator sued us over that. But it only happened one time that I'm aware of. So we also do bonding on well transfers. And so when an operator is selling a well to another operator, we ask for bonding before we'll approve the transfer. And in that scenario, based on the recent revisions, and I say recent, I think we last revised our bonding rules in 2015. But because of the concern at that time of orphan wells upon well transfers, or an operator selling wells to passing a well down to another operator who may not be able to successfully operate that well in the long term, we can hold operator A's bond for 6 months after the transfer to operator B to ensure that operator B is able to successfully operate those wells. Moving on to page 23, idle well bonding and the individual well bonds are what impacts most operators for the Oil and Gas Commission bonding, and results in most of the bonding that we actually hold at the commission. Operators can, as I mentioned, can either post individual well bonds, so they can individually bond every well they own, and that bond rate is at $10 per foot of well bore, of total depth of the well bore. Or an operator can choose to post $100,000 operator blanket bond, which covers all the wells that they own. In the event that they do,
Director, the $100,000 you said covers all the wells. So if they have 300 or 400 wells, $100,000 covers all of those, correct?
Mr. Chairman, it does until we trigger the idle well bonding, which I was just getting ready to talk about. So if they post an operator blanket bond, then in addition to that, if they have wells that are idle, and there's some details that I'll mention here, then we ask them to post additional bonding for their idle wells. So as long as their wells are producing, then we don't ask for any additional bond on top of the $100,000 blanket bond. But once the wells go idle, then we do an annual review for each operator of the list of idle wells that they have. And we can ask for a plan on those wells in lieu of bonding. So we'll ask the operator to supply a plan to either return those wells to production or plug the well if it's no longer of use to the operator. And we'll accept a plan in lieu of bonding. So those plans are valid for a year. Our rule actually, again, based on the last revision to the bonding rule, requires that when supplying the plan, an operator have plans to plug or produce at least 10% of the wells on the idle well list. And so part of that plan is to try to get use out of the well, or to plug it if it's no longer of use. That idle well bond is similar to an individual well bond. It's $10 per foot of well bore. It's slightly different though, in that it's not supplied for the individual well. When we look at that plan, we'll look at the total footage of idle wells that an operator has where they don't have a plan to plug or produce within the next year. And then we'll ask for bond based on that total footage. So in any one year, they may have a well that comes on the idle well list and a different well that goes off. And as long as the total footage doesn't significantly change, then we don't ask for more bond. So it doesn't cover that specific well individually. It covers the well's footage. I think that covers most of the idle well bonding. As I said, we look at that plan for each operator every year, and we have the rules give me the authority to accept a plan or not. Normally, we try to work with the operator to accept their plans. If the operator tells us in the course of a given year that they're going to plug a certain number of wells, and we come back in the next year and looking at the plan, and they've done nothing to accomplish anything, nothing to either return wells to production or plug the wells that they told us, then we're usually a little more stringent after that as far as whether or not we'll continue to accept the plan if they're not accomplishing the work that they're telling us they're going to do. And so that, Mr. Chairman, is on page 24. Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to really talk about the rest of that. We can accept PIP bonds and other bonds, and we can get into questions if you have any of that. At this point in time, the commission, as far as their idle and operator blanket bonding, we hold about $230 million in bonds for all the private wells within the state. Total bonding at the commission, which includes other things like the pit and reservoir bonds, that it would include the seismic bonds, split estate bonds. Total bonding is about $300 million that we hold. Mr. Chairman, unless there's questions, that was the detail I was providing on bonding for at this point.
Any questions? Questions? Okay, right. Brian, this is on our interim topic list. Do you remember who asked to have this one put on? Oh, Representative Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I asked it to
Senator
be put on.
Rothfuss, I
and-
apologize.
And it's very much, no worries. It's very much about the federal rule change that is the focus. And I know that we're going to get some testimony on that. So that I don't personally at this point see any problems with state bonding or anything that we've done. What we did in 2015 seems to have addressed what we needed to do. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've heard no complaints. It comes down to the federal rule change, and I know we've got testimony ahead. So that's the interest there.
Thank you, Senator, for the explanation, the clarification. So with that, I think we'll move to Mr. Obermueller and Mr. Van Cleef.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Peter Obermueller, Petroleum Association of Wyoming. We also asked that this be put on the agenda even before the federal rule final came out, because we are trying to think a little bit creatively about what we could do at the state level with regard to state bonds that could help increase the possibility of investment in our legacy fields, and just explore with Supervisor Kropatch and others how we might do that. It's become a little more obvious that perhaps part of that would be to also help operators deal with the federal rule. So I'll get to that later, but while we're in explanatory mode, we'll turn over to Mr. Van Cleef, who's going to talk about the federal rule and what it looks like from an operator's perspective.
Mr. Van Cleef, good to see you again. You've become a regular.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. And I'm not sure that that's a good thing, but I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, members of the committee, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Tom Van Cleef. I am part of a two-person oil company. I work for my wife, who is the smartest person I've known, but has no taste in men. I'm also privileged to serve on the board of the Petroleum Association, to serve our state and to serve the industry. I'm very heartened to see today that the state of Wyoming continues to act intelligently and is not going to pursue the damaging policies that the federal government is about to put into place. In fact, I need to point out that Wyoming has an opportunity here to counter this federal overreach and provide our state with a means to maintain our most vital industry, as well as to keep capital in Wyoming and to use it for Wyoming and its people. And as Representative Lawley said, to keep Wyoming business friendly. Mr. Chairman, Representative Heiner, you brought up bonding before. I and 470 small operators who are my colleagues are praying that you will consider a state-based oil and gas bonding fund. Such a fund based and could be based, as Senator Rothfuss pointed out to me several months ago, it could be based on Title 35, Wyoming Statute 3511-417, would be managed, administered, and underwritten by the state, but funded by the operators who use it. So it would have a negligible tax impact. It would allow all of Wyoming's oil and gas operators to bond with the state. And that would be for state wells, for fee wells, for idle wells, for all federal wells. This would keep billions of dollars in our state, allowing our state to grow that money rather than having it go to Washington. It would allow our state concerns about bonding for production and idle wells to be covered by all wells and operations, including by the federal operations, thus reducing the risks to Wyoming and our economy. It would preserve our state's tax base, our local communities, our citizens' jobs, and those 470 small operators. So why a state-backed oil and gas fund? Okay, as you know, as the senator brought up, as Mr. Kropatch brought up, The federal government has proposed new bonding requirements for federal wells and facilities, and they will absolutely crater our state. These BLM bond rates will raise our current bonding rates by 15 to 20 times. Now, it's not percent, that's times. To $150,000 for a single lease, which could be a single lease with one well, up to $500,000 for an operator who has more than one lease. And that could, again, be a single lease with one well could trigger that. And ladies and gentlemen, those are the minimums. The BLM has also, in its rules, proposed $71,000 per well as a bonding amount. That is, they can adjust that upwards. Now, we've seen recently, the BLM has a rule, in Instructional Memorandum 2024-14, and they recently applied that and took a Wyoming operator's bond from $300,000 to $1.8 million with 60 days to post the cash bond. So that's what we're looking at, and that's what we're facing as a possibility. How big of a problem will this be for Wyoming? We have 27,383 wells in Wyoming that have a federal nexus that would be subjected to this bonding. Okay? That bonding would be instituted 24 to 36 months after these rules are published and put into effect. And as you heard, those rules have already been put out there. The final rules have been published. They need to be published in the Federal Register. So sometime in the next 2 to 3 years, we face this critical problem. And this will affect the 470 small operators in the state. So if only half of those operators, say 200 companies, have to post a $150,000 bond with the federal government, we're looking at $30 million leaving the state of Wyoming. If only half of those operators have to post a statewide bond of $500,000, you're looking at $100 million that's going to leave the state of Wyoming in 24 months. That's $100 million out of our economy we will never see, never have the ability to use, and that most of those operators can't afford. Now, this assumes that bonding will be at the lowest rates, at that $150,000 or $500,000 rate. But as we've seen, we have to assume that the BLM will start at the minimum that they have estimated of $71,000 a well. For those 22,000 wells, that means that we are going to lose $1.95 billion out of our state in the next 24 to 36 months. $1.95 billion. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a significant amount of money, even for the federal government to suck out of us. Again, what does that mean? If we lose those 200 small operators, we're going to lose 200 small businesses in the state of Wyoming. That doesn't make us business friendly. Can your community, can each one of you look at the people in your community and say that you can afford to lose 700 jobs when those 200 businesses go away? Because that's what those people employ. How about, can your community look at each other? Can you look at each other and say that you can afford to lose the 3,500 additional jobs that rely on those oil and gas operators? And that's in the next 24 months. The effect will cascade. What happens to our state? What happens to the state government? As you all know, and you know these numbers better than anybody else in the state, our small operators, those 470 small businesses, generate about a third of all the oil and gas that's produced. Okay? And as you also know, the oil and gas industry pays 47% all of the state's assessed value taxes. Now, I'm not going to do the math in public. I'm going to rely on my notes. All right, but that tells me that those 470 small operators pay 15% of all of the state's assessed value taxes. And you look at all the other numbers that we have, you discover that if you took all commercial, other industrial, and agriculture combined, they don't pay 15%. Oil and other mining doesn't pay 15%. So essentially, what the BLM's rules will do would be to eliminate effectively the equivalent of our entire coal industry. It would effectively eliminate for our state commercial, industrial, and agricultural. just by eliminating those 200, by eliminating those businesses and those small businesses. Can we afford as a state to lose 7% of our budget in the next 24 to 36 months? Forget about the businesses, forget about the jobs. Can we afford to lose 7% of the budget? Mr. Chairman, that's only if half of the small operators are impacted. It doesn't account for the larger operators or producers, and it doesn't account for the deleterious effect that this will have on producing oil and gas on federal lands in Wyoming. Now, the Oil and Gas Commission and you, the members of this committee, know and understand Wyoming's oil industry. You know that Wyoming oil is not big oil. It's Wyoming oil. It's folks like me. You know that our cost in industry, you know what we pay and what we have to face better than anybody else. You know it's a lot better than federal employees at the BLM or the EPA or the people in Washington or the folks in Grand Junction, Colorado. You know that what we have, our bonding requirements here in the state, are very fair. They're very adequate. $10 a foot more than covers the cost that it's going to cost me if I had been blessed with having a fee well or a state well. That $10 a square foot would absolutely cover my plugging and abandonment costs and allow me to rehabilitate that well site. So we've done an excellent job in our state. But as a committee that's tasked with handling not only minerals, but also business, you know that small business is the lifeblood of our state and our communities. We have 470 small businesses that are at risk. We have an entire state that is at risk because of these federal overreach. You know the numbers, you know it's at stake for Wyoming. I will stay in my seat, but I am literally going to get down on my knees and beg every one of you. I'm going to beg this committee, and I mean this. Please consider coming up with a state bonding fund for the oil and gas industry that will allow us to keep that money in the state of Wyoming. It will allow our small operators, our medium operators, it will allow our large operators to continue to work here in Wyoming and support each other, to support our state wells, our fee wells, and our federal wells. Energy is our lifeblood. This is what we need. And these federal bonding rules will absolutely destroy our industry and our state. So I hope that we'll stay Wyoming strong and Wyoming proud, and we'll work together on this. I can tell you that my colleagues and I are absolutely willing to help and do whatever's necessary and provide whatever assistance we can in drafting the legislation that needs to be done. We've already done it with the mining industry, and we have a great plan. So thank you. And if there are any questions, I will stand.
Questions? Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Van Cleve, thank you for being here and thank you for that, your engagement there. I like this idea. I like the idea how the state can help because the federal government has continued to be aggressive against fossil fuels, and this is the way that we can protect our legacy industries like this. Do you know of any other states that have done a state-backed bonding fund that have legislation already in place? Because I got through engineering school plagiarizing. I don't mind continuing to do that.
Mr. Chairman.
Please.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Heiner, I went to a small school in Colorado where we were not allowed to plagiarize, but I understand that it's an effective way to work. To the best of my knowledge, the closest thing that we have is what Wyoming has in place for the mining industry under that statute 3511-104. And I have to give kudos to Senator Rothfuss because the last time we met, he was the one who suggested this as a possibility. I don't know that any other state has done it. I think that gives Wyoming and this committee the opportunity to lead the way.
Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Van Cleef. I always appreciate your exceptional candor in front of this committee. Conceptually, I really like the idea, and I think there's a ton of merit there. Obviously, it always comes down to details and all that kind of stuff. Maybe I'm just missing something here, but if we can get something like this stood up, running, and it's got adequate levels of liquidity and all the kind of other mechanisms of these kind of bonding concepts, would the BLM, recognize this and understand that we're taking initiative and give us some flexibility on the requirements that they put on you guys, or what would that look like?
Mr. Bankley?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Western. The devil is in the details. And I'm not an elected representative. I'm not an LSO guy. My understanding of how we could do this is the state already has the ability to underwrite insurance. We have unemployment insurance. We have the other insurance systems that states are allowed and authorized and are recognized by the federal government. If we were to take and set up a system that was essentially a surety system, an underwritten bond, all right, then the requirements that the BLM has, very similar to what we have here with the LSO covered. The BLM, we would have a surety bond that was underwritten. It would be actuarially, I guess I said that word right. The actuaries would come in and determine what the risks were. As you know, as everybody in the room knows, the risk of a well having to be plugged and abandoned is 0.0021%. If I do my math right, that's 21 millionths of 1% is the risk factor. So I think it is possible for us to set this up. I think we set it up as a surety bond underwritten by the state. And the only difference is it would have the goodwill of the state of Wyoming backing the surety company up, in addition to having all of the payments that would be made in, and it would run just like a surety bond. Bond would be issued, the people who took out the bond would make an initial payment, and they would make an annual payment into that fund. And then the fund would continue to be self-perpetuating. Does that answer your question, sir?
Mr. Co-Chair was next. And then Senator Rothfuss.
I appreciate the whole concept here. This one's going to take some time to hear out, but it's definitely worth pursuing. I would suggest, and Senator Rothfuss will probably jump in on this, that we start the process, Mr. Co-Chair, to draft a bill that we can take through our next few meetings and gather public input, because this involves a lot of people across the state, a lot of finances. Excellent proposal. Keeps everything within Wyoming, which we should be doing, and open up opportunities for us. But pending further public comment, others here on the committee, I think we should start the process of drafting a bill for state-backed bonding fund.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I did have a Mr. Fuller draft legislation for last legislative sessions, but it really wasn't ready. This is hard. And after reading it, I thought we needed an interim to work on it through this committee and to bring in all the stakeholders and get it to the point where it does what it's supposed to do. Also, not knowing what the final rule was going to be like, and not knowing what interactions we'd be able to have on behalf of the state to achieve surety with the feds that they'd be comfortable with. It seemed like we needed to do more work on it. So we do have a starting point, at least. We've got a bill that was mirrored after effectively after our trust for coal sector to be able to self-bond through that trust. That was the concept. But it won't quite work. I think it needs some revision. And again, this is something that I think is incredibly important. We heard the reasons why, and we need to get it done in this legislative session, in my view, based on the timeline of when it will be impactful. So to me, this is probably our highest priority of the things that we have on our radar, because we need to get it done, and it's going to have very significant effects. But if we get to the point where, for our operators in the state of Wyoming, operating on federal land is roughly equivalent to operating on state land from a bonding standpoint, so that there's not much of a difference in how they feel it, and we just manage it differently, I think that'll be an incredible outcome. We know from our regrettably tremendous experience, because we have plugged and abandoned 5,000, 6,000 wells. We have a pretty good sense of how to do it, how much it costs, and I don't think anybody understands the actual risk better than the state of Wyoming. So I feel like we're not going to get ourselves in a position where we're going to not understand the risk, and we've we've done a pretty good job of being able to calculate that. So the challenge that I see is that the risk expressed by the feds in their numbers is much greater than the real risk. And there's no reason why the state can't reasonably set up a structure to backstop the risk, we'll call it the unreal risk, right? Because it's not going to be hit at any point, and then establish a structure of true risk based on our experience that's consistent with our bonding, and have it be totally cost neutral for the state, except for from the perspective of the revenue that we get. And then if we build in a revenue structure so that we have small pay-ins over time, as we do with our orphan and abandoned account, we should be able to make this just neutral for industry. And I think that's the best outcome that we can achieve. And I think we can do that. So I hope we will take this very seriously, get together maybe one more working group or something, and work with industry to get the bill that was already drafted into the right place.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, with that, I'll Mr. Obermuller, you wish to say something before?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of points, and really appreciate Mr. Van Cleef being here. I don't need to repeat everything he said. I won't. I will issue one correction. He mentioned the one Wyoming operator that BLM required going from 300,000 bond to 1.8. It's actually 4.8 million. They required him to go from $300,000 to 4.8 million in that time period. Just absurd. But what I wanted to say is that even before the federal rule, this is what's really lit the fire, of course, because of the existential threat that it is to our small operators. But even before that, this was in our minds because Mr. Van Cleef was exactly right that our state bonding program is good, it's well run, it's fair, but it does hinder the ability to invest upfront in keeping some of our legacy fields running from people who are interested in investing in Wyoming, because for reasonable reasons that Supervisor Kopach mentioned, the transfer bond and those sorts of things, they're trying to make sure, as we all are, that companies, that operators have the obligation to take care of their their reclamation and plugging in abandonment responsibilities and all that. But that does it has limited the ability for companies to come in and invest in those because it requires all that upfront money. And so our initial thought on this was developing a system where similar to the trust or whatever, where you start to pay into the system so that not all of that happens up front in order to encourage investment in these fields as opposed to encourage shutting them down. So there's actually just from our state bonding perspective, there's incentive to do it just for that. Now, if we can write it in a way that helps to deal with this issue, all the better. And just so you all know, the Petroleum Association is joining with our friends at the North Dakota Petroleum Council, the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, and the Utah Petroleum Association and the Western Energy Alliance to file suit on that rule. We'll probably file that this week sometime, next week sometime. So that will be there'll be another prong there, but regardless of that, there's reasons to do it on this side as well. One last thing I want to say on the federal side, just so you all know, what you'll hear, and I think just in this conversation, is you might hear, well, it's the state coming in to try to stop or to try to protect companies from doing what they should do anyway, which is deal with their plug and abandon. As Senator Roth started to point out, that's not the case factually, but I want you to understand that on the BLM side of it, what you'll hear is that they haven't changed the minimum bonding since 1960, whatever, and that is true. But the BLM has always had the authority to do inspections and do the reviews like Supervisor Kopach does in his agency, and then adjust bonds based on risk. They've always had that authority to do that. So just because it's at the minimum, they could set it where they wanted to, number one. And to that end, BLM Wyoming holds $85 million already in bonding authority for the federal wells that Mr. Van Cleef mentioned. And as he mentioned, this rule would elevate that to 1.9 billion, not based really on any sort of real risk assessment of what we're looking at in terms of abandonment in Wyoming. So just wanted to highlight those couple points and happy to take further questions, but I think we've covered it. Oh, one more thing, Mr. I will say that I think a working group is probably the right idea. I don't exactly know. Part of the reason why we didn't come with specific suggestions of what to do, not exactly sure how to set it up. The coal one is a trust and it's not pooled. The trust is it's voluntary. Each individual company can do it and contribute to the trust, and it's tied to that individual company. We had considered it being a pool situation, but we've heard some industry warning about that from experiences in West Virginia and others on the coal side, not the oil and gas side. So there's some things to look at, and I think a working group is probably appropriate.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Questions for Mr.
I don't-
Co-Chair?
I'll wait. I don't have a question. for him.
Okay, all right. So with that, I'll open it to public comment. Any comments from the public? Anyone online?
Mr.
Okay.
Chairman, we do have someone online.
All right, please let them in.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Shannon Anderson on behalf of Powder River Basin Resource Council. And I did send you some information by email, so I won't repeat that this morning. But I did want to highlight 4 things in response to the comments and testimony that you've already heard today. First, as Supervisor Kropatch has said, Wyoming's bonding requirements are largely in rule. They're not in statute. And that gives the agency the flexibility they really need to adjust bonding requirements over time. And we would just caution and discourage you from putting anything additional in the statute or weakening Wyoming's bonding requirements through statute. That's just not the vehicle to do that. So it really does kind of, I think, limit your jurisdiction over what you can do with the state program, which, I mean, we wholeheartedly agree is a great program. It's ran well. It took a while to get there, but we're there. And, you know, we really encourage you not to weaken any of those state standards. But second, I would just highlight that the federal and state systems are different. And federal bonding is done on a lease basis. It's not done on a well basis. And it's limited by the authority in the Mineral Leasing Act. And so we just can't replicate the state system at the federal level. It's not possible. Third, I would highlight that the Bureau of Land Management and the Department of the Interior is, of course, giving out lots of money related to orphan well plugging across the country. And there's grants coming up relatively soon that are what are called performance grants. And they're based on states actually improving bonding requirements. And so if the state weakens bonding requirements, we largely will not be eligible for those grants, which could be a large sum of money left on the table for the state of Wyoming. So I would just, you know, encourage you to think through the federal money available for orphan well plugging, the opportunities the state may have to receive that money, and have that kind of interacted within your discussions related to any legislation you may want to propose. And fourth, on the federal numbers themselves, I would just push back a little bit against those numbers that you just heard. As you know, sureties are essentially like insurance. You post collateral, you know, your insurance, you know, you don't insure for the entire price of your car, for instance. You put, you know, some money down based on the risk associated with you as a driver. And so, you know, you're looking at a percent of those numbers. And in most cases, those percentages are relatively small. I would also highlight that in the final rule, the BLM did suggest that operators who actually are small businesses can go to the Small Business Administration for help in getting sureties and surety coverage. So there is opportunity already, if you are actually a small business, to be able to get some assistance if you're having trouble qualifying for sureties and covering those surety amounts. So we would just encourage you to, again, think cautiously about the state's role here, the state's risk, and really to kind of push back against the sky is falling kind of rhetoric that you heard this morning. That just isn't going to be the case. And really, you know, these federal rules, they're smart, they're long overdue. Let's give them time to work to see what's going to happen. You know, operators have 3 years if they have a lease bond to come into compliance. There's no rush right now to come to the table and bail out the industry. So let's really, you know, I think exercise caution, think strategically, and protect the state's interest. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Ms. Anderson, you said you emailed us some information. I just looked, I don't have it yet. And the good co-chairman doesn't have it, so if you would either resend it or make sure we get it.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I will. I sent it last Friday. So you would have it well in advance of the meeting.
Oh. Oh, okay, I misunderstood you. I do have that.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay,
you.
yes. No, that's right. I wanted you to have time to review it before you met today.
Thank you. So any questions for Ms. Anderson? Any questions? No? Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else? Any other people out in the virtual land? Nope, okay. Last call. Any other public comment? Any governor office want to chime in anything? Okay, thank you. I'll close public testimony.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I'd like to, just for a moment, before calling for a motion on this, I'd like to hear from Senator Rothfuss, the kind of the template that he set up is, are we close? Does the working group refine it? I'm worried about not having enough time between now and session to really refine a complicated topic. Senator Rothfuss, did you have something started? You said you held it up.
Senator?
Mr. Chairman, we do have a first draft, but it's very similar to what Mr. Obermueller talked about, where it ends up being isolated to an individual operator in a way that doesn't work for this circumstance. And so it needs to be revised. So I do think it is going to take a good bit of work. But I think that we've got plenty of time before session. Hopefully we could get an early draft done by our next meeting. That would be good if we could,
Well, that,
but we might not. We'll get one done though.
yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would make a motion, we get that initial draft ready for the next meeting. So we can come back and take an in-depth look, and that gives all the stakeholders an opportunity to have a look at it public wise.
Yes.
So we can start the process, whether or not you think a working group is necessary. It's just getting that piece of work ready for the public at our next meeting.
Okay. So, Mr. Co-Chair, I think we should use a working group for this. I think this could become complex. Obviously, Senator Rothfuss has done a lot of work on it. I've worked on other bills with the good senator, and if he says it wasn't ready and it needs work, I can understand the difficulty. So I would.
Well, that's the motion, and then we get ready for the next meeting.
Okay, to do the motion being a working group and.
A working group, and we prepare a draft for our next meeting.
Okay, motion's on the table. Does everyone understand the motion? Okay, any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Okay, motion is adopted. And if it's acceptable with the committee, go ahead, Representative Western.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'd be more than happy to be a House member on that working group if you'd like.
Okay, and that was where I was going. So let's see. I will assume, am I correct, Senator Rothfuss, that you'll do that? Representative Western, Representative Lawley sent me we pass notes now. This is like 8th grade, that she would want to be on it. So I think we have 3. Okay, Representative Banks. Okay, and Senator Ellis. Okay.
It's modern day.
All right. Okay. Anyone else? I know this is a topic that interests a lot of you. I would ask that Director Kropatch, Mr. Obermueller, Mr. Van Cleef be available for those discussions also. And I would say that let the working group pull in anyone they need to. Brian, do you have all of that? Okay, thank you. All right, so moving on. Next topic is School of Energy Resources, transfer of the Integrated Test Center.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Holly Krecka, Executive Director of the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources. And thank you for pulling up my slides. So I wanted to give a little background. This topic is an update on operations and transfer of the Integrated Test Center. And just to give folks background on the ITC, or the Integrated Test Center, it was established in 2016 with $15 million from the state of Wyoming, $5 million from Tri-State Generation and Transmission, and $1 million from NRECA. The ITC is a technology neutral test center where technology developers who are inventing and need to test carbon capture and use technologies can come up, plug in their equipment, and have access to real flue gas. And the real flue gas is provided by Basin Electric's Dry Fork Power Station. I've already mentioned it over the course of these 3 days. It's an incredible power plant, one of the newest, cleanest coal-fired power plants in the country. And the ITC really has been a great partnership between the state of Wyoming and rural electric co-ops. Initially, the ITC was managed by the governor's office and the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority. When the Infrastructure Authority when that ceased to exist, and then the Wyoming Energy Authority was created, that's where it moved. About a year ago, the governor asked the School of Energy Resources, well, maybe not asked, delegated the ITC to the School of Energy Resources. So we inherited that activity, about $5 million of remaining funds. In the last year, there has been a tremendous amount of activity at the ITC. And just to be clear, this is a little different than our normal mode of operation. So usually we're doing the research and taking our technologies out into the field. This is an administration of a test center that where others are bringing their technologies. I think there are technologies being developed at the University of Wyoming that could be tested at the ITC, but our main role in this is really one to administer the operations of the center. It, from a timing perspective, makes sense. We have a lot of projects in Campbell County around the area. We have Carbon Safe, right, also associated with the same power plant. We also have two coal to products demonstrations that will be happening in Campbell County, or carbon engineering, the pyrolysis and the solvent extraction to make the asphalt, which we've already talked about. So we have a lot of big operational projects in the area. So I always start with our mission, which is energy-driven economic development, and moving to the next slide, keep going. So Mr. Co-Chairman, or Mr. Chairman and Mr. Co-Chairman, there is a lot of activity happening at the Integrated Test Center. Just wanted to provide some pictures of the construction underway. So the Membrane Technology Research is currently building a 10 megawatt capture large-scale pilot. And that construction is underway. You can see it's quite a large facility. The cool thing about this technology, if it works, it has to be proven. It's been proven at smaller scales, is that for a carbon capture technology, it uses a lot less water. And so that could be important for coal-fired power plants and even gas-fired power plants around the country. On the bottom, you can see another technology being demonstrated at a smaller scale, 1 megawatt, which is still a large scale pilot. And for reference, this power plant's about a 400 megawatt power plant. And the one on the bottom is actually using a dry sorbent, a solid sorbent for CO2 capture, and that's Kawasaki Heavy Industries technology. So next slide, please. Okay, so I already said the purpose and who this is supported by. I think I've already mentioned that one of our new initiatives is really to connect coal-fired power plants, or the owners and operators of coal-fired power plants, with the technology vendors and developers directly, so that they can understand where the state of different technologies are. This is not their everyday mode of operation. So we do have, I think, about 10 PRB consumers coming at the end of this month to what we call the ITC Technology Showcase. Some of them are rather large and operate some of the biggest coal-fired power plants in the country. So we'll help them. And by the way, there's also other services and support that we can provide. So I've mentioned a couple times the funding coming from Peabody. One thing we can do with that is also help them look at CO2 storage options that their power plants might not be able to access. You have to understand that other states haven't done as much work on making it possible to advance carbon capture and storage as Wyoming. So there are right now EPA regulations that will require the installation of this technology or closing these plants. And if there's a lifeline we can throw to these plants, we're going to do it. So we're looking at, can they access a pipeline that goes to CO2 EOR? There aren't that many pipelines outside Wyoming and North Dakota, but or we'll look for storage options in their area, whatever they can access. And we'll talk about all these opportunities, what the state of Wyoming can do to help them keep their plants operating. So the current schedule for vendors at the ITC can see we have, it's just showing, basically we have, the brown is either commissioning or construction and commissioning, and then decommissioning, and then the yellow is shown by the operation, the actual testing timeframe. And then the numbers on those are just the number of megawatts that are being tested. So right now, MTR is the largest. There's about 20 megawatts of flue gas available. So for the first time ever, we'll be using technologies to amount for more than half of the flue gas being consumed. So we can go to the next slide. There is one project that was selected for it's called Large Scale Pilot Program. It's being run by the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations at the Department of Energy. It's another project by a developer we already have on site called TDA. Right now they are in FEED study. That's just a paper study. So if this were to move to full scale commercialization, I've showed the schedule here. They would use basically all the flue gas at the ITC. Having said that, currently, I just want to highlight that there's a couple things I want to highlight about this. If they were to move forward, we would need to extend the lease with Basin Electric to include their full operational and decommissioning period. The other thing I'm going to talk about is the funding. So we don't have enough funding to operate this through the end of 2031. It was never envisioned to operate this long, so there's been a number of lease extensions. So we have been pursuing, if this were to come to fruition beyond a FEED study, and just so you know, there will be a down select of technology. So this one's selected to go through the paper study. That doesn't mean it's going to proceed to full scale operation. The Department of Energy will choose a subset of those being looked at on paper to actually become operational. We have been trying to raise more funds for this. There is another test center in the US, it's in Alabama. They receive quite a substantial amount of federal funding for their operation. We have never received that. So we did write an application and that was not reviewed. The DOE said it was outside their office's funding capabilities. We're going to take that as a first answer and continue to pursue that. So as of now, we have about 3.8 million in cash, and it's being invested by the UW Foundation. So we are getting interest revenue on that funds, but and 700,000 of that 3.8 million are reserved for making sure that we can, once the life of the ITC is finished, that we can reclaim that site. So really, we have about 3.1 for operating. We're right now spending about 1.2 million per year in operations. And I already mentioned the UW Foundation is earning us some funds on the cash. So for all the projects that are on site or slated to come on site, we believe we have sufficient funding to continue the operations. Anything beyond that, I think we'll have to look at whether or not we can accept longer term. I just want to be clear, we're not asking for any money for this. But I just want to be fully transparent about where we are.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. Dr. Crick, how are those conversations then going if somebody's interested in using the facility? If we don't have a runway beyond 2 years, nobody's going to have a project that is ready to go within 2 years, so to speak. So is that holding back those conversations, or what is that dynamic? I do think this is something we should really consider now. I know you're not asking for money, but if we want to continue the project, we need to understand and we need to give you a runway that allows you to function.
Dr. Crick?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Office. So far, everyone we've talked to has been able to mobilize and test within those 2 years, with the exception of that TDA large scale pilot. The smaller ones can. So to date, we have not been hindered by this. I don't want to get too far out in front of my horse here, but there is rumors that there will be a competitive solicitation for test centers coming out in a few weeks. This is carbon capture test centers were actually authorized but not appropriated in the BIL package. And so there's some opportunities potentially. But we have not, to directly answer your question, we have not quite reached that issue yet. So.
Hey, Representative Conrad.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Director Cook, just a quick question on the $700,000 that's been reserved for deconstruction reclamation. Can you tell me what the split of that is, out of curiosity?
Dr. Crick?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, I can't tell you that right now, but I can get that for you. It was a study that was done when the facility was first being built. So I'll get those numbers and provide them to the committee.
Thank you.
Other questions? Other questions? Okay. Dr. Crick, proceed.
Okay. So moving on to our next slide, where we are today. Again, I just wanted to show some more operational pictures, groundbreakings, and hosting visitors and quite a bit of construction on site. So where we are, the funds have been successfully transferred from the Wyoming Energy Authority and are being invested. We have vendors on site through 2026 now. And the one issue we are facing that, Mr. Chairman, about a year ago, this is a good opportunity to highlight that Senator Ellis made a couple comments that were correct. And we are facing some of the issues that she had raised concerns about. So right now, we're in a position where the governor's office, even though we're operating the ITC, the governor's office has to execute the leases. And it's because we're operating it, it's just been problematic in putting a lot of work onto the governor's office and slowing down the process of putting leases in place. So I think we would request, it is my understanding it will need legislation to fix that. So we would request that the University of Wyoming and the School of Energy Resources has full authority to, if we're operating this facility, or whoever operates this facility has the full authority to execute leases. And Mr. Chairman, that is all I have on the Integrated Test Center.
Okay. So, Mr. Luthi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, Randall Luthi, Policy Advisor for Governor Gordon. One of the nice things about working with Dr. Krutke is if you let her go first, the areas are pretty much covered and covered much better than I would be able to do them. But I'll just touch base. The ITC was created by the legislature, back 2014 and 15. At that time, the money was authorized and given to the office of the governor to run it. As you might know, that's before our current administration. That Governor Meade used WIA. We liked that theory. We went along and delegated most of the duties to run the day-to-day operations to the WEA. And then we began that discussion of, well, what do we do next? As Dr. Krutke appropriately pointed out, we had actually an AG opinion that indicated that you may try to delegate everything to SER. And by the way, delegate means that, we do ask. And let me give you an example. We would say, Holly, don't you think it's a great idea for you to run the ITC? Isn't that an ask? Correct. Yes. All right then. Yeah. So, and then after the affirmative answer, we actually do the actual writing of the delegation. But the AG's office said you can't delegate everything. And a couple of things that they said should remain with the governor's office as a result of the original legislation was the actual leasing of the property to these companies that would like to test. You know, we're glad to do that, but I'll tell you, it takes a lot of time from one member of our staff. They negotiate with the companies, and then we also turn around and work with the general counsel's office at the University of Wyoming. So we are in complete agreement. Like a proud parent, we have nursed this project along. We have got it through junior high. We have survived high school with this project. It is now up and running, and while it may not be completely out of college yet and ready for, you know, a great career, SCR is certainly the appropriate place for this program. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd entertain questions.
Okay. Questions for Mr. Luthi? Senator Ellis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Krucka touched on this in her presentation, but you know, recently the EPA made some announcements, and the long and short of it is for any existing coal-fired electrical generating unit that plans to operate beyond 2039, 90% of CO2 emissions have to be captured by 2032. It's an aggressive goal. I think a lot of people in the industry are wildly concerned about this. And so she talked about it. I don't think we've talked about it much during these last several days, but this is a big, big issue out there. I think we know that, and we've been planning for it. We've allocated dollars to be used to defend Wyoming's interest in litigation. Maybe not today, but at some point in the future, maybe at our next hearing, we get an update, and that would be appropriate maybe for executive session where we can just get an understanding of the universe of all the lawsuits that are out there and what Wyoming's plan is, also with an update so we know how the dollars that we've been allocating to defend these Wyoming's interests, how those are helping support the effort. But, you know, Dr. Krucka mentioned that, and it's been something we haven't talked about, and it's very significant.
Okay.
And I had to look at my notes because there are 3 different classifications for these units. And I just wanted to make sure I got the details right. So anyway, would you be willing to work with us to get an update on all of that? And this is, Mr. Chairman, if I may just say a little bit more. I mean, we have this conversation all the time about the appropriateness of the legislature intervening in lawsuits. I think it would help provide some tremendous value for our committee to understand the backside of it and how the executive branch handles this. So maybe provide some assurance that maybe Wyoming doesn't need 2 voices in litigation, something along those lines.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. You know, that sounded an awful lot like a request to delegate, right? Like I just told you about. We, of course, Mr. Chairman, would be happy to meet with the Minerals Committee and with whomever you would like to be able to go into more detail. I think we will discuss those regulations more this afternoon.
Okay. Brian, just another thing for the agenda for the next meeting. Thank you. Other questions?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Co-Chair.
somewhat of a comment with a question though, too. I'll take it back to Mr. Luthy's taking us through the steps of schooling, so to speak. Maybe it's the School of Energy Resources that helps us with this place. I've been there many times, and it's always, we're testing this, we're doing that. And in my simple mind, because I'm not an expert, I'm thinking, what takes us across the finish line? So very comfortable that Dr. Krucka is now taking this, although she probably didn't want more on her workload. But I thought maybe that's where we get our master's degree, our doctorate, and we actually take something across the finish line and complete it, and we help the industry. Right now, I'm just thinking more testing and millions of dollars. What takes us to the, Mr. Luthi, I guess you can answer that. I'm happy that Dr. Krucka is taking it over. What takes us across the finish line?
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Co-Chairman, thank you for that question. It's a fabulous question. And I'll just back up just one step. I often try to take very complex engineering and carbon capture technologies and put them in my terminology. And Dr. Krutka cringes every time I even come close to that, but I do appreciate that. What takes us across the line is I believe where we are headed is that we're looking at more than one technology. Currently, it's the amine technology that has been proven to be commercially effective. That is on the Petra Nova plant in Texas. You will recall it opened. They had problems marketing. They were using the CO2 largely for, I think, entirely for EOR. Shut down because of economics. I think about 6-8 months ago, they came back on operation and it's working. Project Tundra was the project Dr. Krutka mentioned in North Dakota that received the initial funding from DOE to build another coal-fired power plant with carbon capture. That's also looking at the amine technology. Again, that we know that works. What we're doing at the ITC is we have another absorbent technology. We have another membrane technology. There are other ways to catch and capture carbon. There's other companies such as 8 Rivers who are going to be involved probably with Rocky Mountain Power as they move forward, also has a technology. So what I would say, Mr. Chairman, and a long way to answer your question, is we get across the finish line because we get more than one technology to choose from. We find out which one is the most cost effective, and then we take those next steps to how do we make sure it becomes at commercial scale. One of the issues with the regulations that Senator Ellis brought up is they don't give us that time to do it. They say, oh, yes, use carbon capture, but get it on by 2032. Right now, you would be limited probably to 1, maybe 2 technologies. But companies want more choices, and there may very well be less expensive choices as we continue to do testing like this at the ITC. Thank you.
Senator Jones.
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Krutka, have any of the other coal plants across the state weighed in on this or expressed interest in joining in some of these programs?
Either of you? Dr. Krutka.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Jones, yes, they have. So that's one of the things I wanted to say about how do we get this across the finish line. I mean, first of all, even if power plants wanted to use the existing commercial technologies, they can't ramp up fast enough to meet the EPA rule timeline to serve all the plants in the country. So we actually need more technologies. I don't think the timeline is consistent with the rate of technology development, but I want you to know the ITC and the technologies being tested there, it's just one thing we're doing. So in addition to that, we are working with specific power plants, both inside and outside the state, and their owners and operators to try to see what we can do to support them. And they are engaged and they're interested in working with us and understanding how we can help, how we can add this technology. I think it's challenging because carbon capture and storage is different, not the capture side, but the storage side. Or even if you're using EOR, it's very different than other emission control technologies. I mean, you've seen Black Hills Energy, for example, be very innovative in what they're looking at. And so I think we're working with everyone, we're looking at the full portfolio. The other thing I wanted to flag, just that you all should know, is that the timeline that the EPA sets forth is extremely aggressive, may be concerning from an electric reliability standpoint. I think folks are looking at that now. I would also flag that, like, for example, we have been working really hard to bring in federal grants around CO2 storage. We've been selected for those, and the timeline for getting our projects actually moving is historically slow. So from the time we know we have been selected, some projects that are the larger ones, these are very applied, getting steel in the ground. We're a year out now from being selected and do not have a contract in place. That has never happened before. So at the same time, you're seeing like regulations coming really fast, and like this assistance is supposed to help the technology get to or beyond college, get to commercial maturity, it's not coming fast. And so there's this really stark dichotomy that we're facing. And I want you guys to know that that's also an issue that we're facing as well, but we will do everything we can to help these plants.
Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Cook, I certainly echo those sentiments. I believe one of humanity's greatest achievements was delivering extremely reliable, extremely affordable power, and that's a huge concern with some of those regs that you mentioned. My question actually is to Mr. Luthi. I deeply welcome the announcement yesterday from the governor's office about joining some of these lawsuits about the Mercury Rule, clean air, all that kind of stuff. I want to say it was originally, it's like 4 years ago. And then 2 years ago, we made some amendments to some of the money that the legislature set aside for the governor's office through the AG to pursue. I assume that with these announcements, that money is going to start being deployed, and for that litigation and supporting efforts for that litigation. Is that a fair assumption, or what is the status of getting that money actually out of the ground and used as intended?
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for that question. Yes, the short answer is yes, but it is a complicated yes. And let me just give you an example on the Clean Power Plan version 2. West Virginia was the state that led the coalition against the first time we dealt with this issue. They have a cadre of attorneys within their office. They put together a coalition. They were able to get all the information they needed and were very successful. Wyoming joined that coalition. And when you join other states, that also reduces the individual cost. We are currently right now trying to look at various proposals to put in front of the AG to see if that is something that they need extra help on. But that's just one. We also have, we might also be looking at the water discharge rule, which was released the same day. We also have coal ash. We also have the mercury air toxic standards. Those are all issues that we are willing to take to the AG and encourage the use of those funds. Well, the AG, as you know, is extremely good, and she's also very conservative on spending money. But we are in those negotiations, which was rather a long way to answer your question.
Follow up? Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Day, I do appreciate that, absolutely. I would love to see Wyoming kind of being the tip of the spear on that, but I certainly respect West Virginia's efforts there. Do you have a timeline for actually getting that money out the door? Because no doubt, obviously, the Attorney General, she's highly capable and skilled, but I think that the clock is ticking, and some kind of timeline would be great to see where we can actually start deploying those funds, whether it be for direct litigation for attorneys or for kind of policy analysts. I know we've spent money with our EPN efforts in the past that did a really good job of breaking down what is needed and where in terms of some of the power grid. So is there a timeline that you guys have envisioned to start actually writing checks and getting that money to work?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, not a specific timeline, but frankly, I have to tell you, it has to be pretty quick. Because if you want to get information that might be used for an initial request for a stay, we're talking months at most. More likely weeks. So again, hopefully we're going to get a proposal that the AG is very comfortable with and will believe will actually bring in extra information that will help the case. And again, I don't mean to sound vague on it at all. We know the money's there. A lot of people knows the money's there. We're willing to use it, but we are cautious about just throwing money when it may not be necessary. I will point out that no other state has more to lose than Wyoming if these regulations, actually are upheld. So we are looking at it very seriously.
So we're getting a little far afield of this topic on the ITC. We're running a little ahead of schedule, and maybe we can add this in, but I would like to wrap up the discussion of the ITC before we go somewhere else. So, yes, Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I did have just a quick question. Mr. Luthi, you mentioned a few minutes ago a project with 8 Rivers associated with Rocky Mountain. I hadn't heard that they were actually doing anything. I mean, I'm familiar with 8 Rivers and tried to get them to do something in Wyoming about 8 years ago. So that's good to hear, but what's up with that?
All right, Mr. Chairman, hopefully I'm not divulging stuff I wasn't supposed to divulge, but there's another company known as SK, and 8 Rivers is generally their contractor. Does that help? No.
Not quite yet.
Mr. Chairman, looking, yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, that is the company that's looking at currently at Dave Johnston.
Thank you.
So just to add into that, that was in Rocky Mountain Power's updated or modified resource plan. So that's where that information comes from. I don't think it's proprietary. They publicly stated it, so, but they were going to work with those 2 companies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I didn't know that was 8 Rivers that was working with them. So thank you for that. Appreciate it.
So, okay. All right, any other questions? Okay. Public comment on the Integrated Test Center and other things. Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Sean Taylor on behalf of Wyoming's Rural Electric Cooperatives. I'll make this quick. And I talked to you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Co-Chair. There were maybe some concerns. The co-ops have been involved at the ITC from the get-go, both from financial investments from Tri-State Generation and Transmission Cooperative, our national organization, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, and of course with Basin Electric, with the physical donation, if you will, of the Dry Fork Power Plant. And there were some rumblings that there may be some concerns about the transfer of governance from the governor's office to SER. I've talked to all 3 of those organizations. We're fine with it. We are fully in support of Dr. Krutka and her team keeping us involved and engaged to the level that we need to be. So I just wanted to just remind everybody that we've been involved with this. The co-op's been involved with this from day one, and B, that we don't have any concerns with the transfer of governance, if you will. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions for Mr. Taylor? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you.
Anyone else here speak on the issue? Anyone online? Okay, with that, I'll close public testimony. Committee?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Ellis.
I move that we have a bill draft ready for our next meeting that would address the governance issues and leasing authority for the School of Energy Resources
Second.
to administer projects at the ITC.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Committee, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Okay. Oh, yeah. All right. Brian, you have that one. And for the committee, we did have a draft prepared last session to do this again. Budget session didn't make introduction, and I think we can just base it off of that. Thank you. Okay, so we are ahead of schedule considerably. I hesitate going to the next topic too quickly.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
you need to buy a little time. The pizzas are on their way.
Okay. So with that, Mr. Luthi, don't leave. Maybe don't even get comfortable there. So what I was going to say was is we do have time. We have people scheduled to speak on the topics that'll come in during lunch and after lunch. And I hesitate starting too early because they're on a schedule. They've been kind enough to join us to talk about some of these issues. They're legislators from Utah. And I appreciate their ability to do this. One legislator offered to come in personally. And I told him to stay home. He has shingles, but offered to be here. He's that passionate about the topic. So we'll defer a little bit. So if you'd like to continue with the line that Representative Western went down, if you wish to discuss CO2 issues, EPA issues, we could do that. We do have roughly 45 minutes to stare at each other if we don't do anything, or if there's a different topic people would like to discuss at this point. Senator Ellis,
Mr. Chairman, I wouldn't mind making a few phone calls and catching up with
Okay.
people.
Representative Lawley. You were going to say something?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I actually would just like to revisit that issue concerning the lawsuits and just again express some thoughts on that.
Okay, just a minute. Okay, so I think all of us, I'll take Senator Ellis's suggestion. We just recess at this point, knowing that pizzas are on their way in, don't run off. And then we'll resume as soon as we can at roughly noon to do a working lunch. For those scheduled, Mr. Burbidge, does that work for you? Okay. Okay, and who else we have? I think, well, I know it'll work for the Utah legislators. And I think that's pretty much everybody. For those of you who are here on to talk and learn on those electrical issues, if you could bear with us. Okay. And for Mr. Bush, if you noticed, I did not call on you today. So, okay, we're recessed until noon.
And I would have called on